Next day, she gets the shock of her life. Have you ever thought that a quiet evening could alter the course of a lifetime? For 80-year-old Mrs. Ruby Carter, the answer came unexpectedly during what seemed like an ordinary shift at Poppy's Cafe. Follow the whole story and don't forget to subscribe to the channel and leave your opinion below in the comment section. It motivates us to share more impactful stories. Nestled in the heart of a small town, Poppy's was a second home to Ruby. The aging waitress, her silver-streaked hair tucked neatly under a bright scarf, carried an air of warmth that endeared her to regulars. She had spent decades balancing plates and coffee pots, serving the locals with a smile and a touch of motherly care. That night, as the clock neared closing time, Ruby hummed softly to herself while wiping down the counters. The usual crowd of retirees had dwindled, leaving only a couple of familiar faces sipping the last of their coffee. She cherished these moments of quiet, a time to reflect and remember her late husband, who had always encouraged her to keep her light shining. The soft chime of the doorbell startled her, drawing her eyes to the entrance. There, stepping into the warm glow of the cafe lights, was a figure she instantly recognized from television. Elon Musk. Ruby froze, her weathered hands gripping the damp cloth. Elon Musk? Here? In her little cafe? The whispers started almost immediately among the regulars. Is that really him? One muttered, eyes wide. Yes, that's Elon Musk, another replied, his voice tinged with awe and skepticism. Elon, dressed casually but unmistakably himself, scanned the room before settling at a booth by the window. He seemed oddly out of place, yet comfortable in the quaint surroundings. His tired expression hinted at a long day, yet there was a spark of curiosity in his eyes as he gazed out at the sleepy street beyond. Ruby gathered her composure and approached the table, her years of experience masking her nervousness. "Good evening, sir," she said, her voice steady and warm. "What can I get for you tonight?" He looked up, his expression softening. "Just a coffee, black, and maybe a slice of pie, if you've got any left." "We've always got pie," Ruby replied with a kind smile, turning toward the counter. As she prepared his order, murmurs rippled across the cafe. The regulars weren't just curious. Their skepticism was palpable. Ruby could feel the weight of their judgment hanging in the air. By the time she returned to Elon's table, carrying the coffee and pie, she could hear snippets of conversation drifting from the other tables. "What's he doing here?" someone grumbled. "I bet he's scouting for land or something," another added, his tone laced with disdain. Ruby frowned as she set the plate and cup in front of Elon. "Here you go, sir." "Enjoy," she said, her voice unwavering despite the tension she could feel. "Thank you," he replied, offering her a small, appreciative nod before turning back to his coffee. But the murmurs didn't stop. In fact, they grew louder, emboldened by a regular named Frank, a retired factory worker known for his bluntness. Rising from his seat, Frank marched over to Elon's table, his presence commanding the room's attention. "Excuse me," Frank began, crossing his arms. "Aren't you the guy who's always in the news about AI and rockets? The one stirring up all kinds of trouble?" Elon looked up, setting his cup down with measured patience. "I suppose I am," he replied, his tone calm. Frank scoffed. "You say you're making AI for the good of humanity, but isn't it just about power and money? Some of us don't buy into all that." A few murmurs of agreement echoed from the other tables. Ruby, standing by the counter, felt a pang of discomfort. This wasn't just a conversation, it was an ambush. Elon's expression didn't waver, though Ruby noticed a flicker of tension in his posture. "AI is a tool," he said, his voice steady but firm. "It's about how we use it. I want to ensure it's developed responsibly, aligned with truth and transparency." Frank snorted. "Yeah, right. You just want to be in control. Same as all those other billionaires." Ruby couldn't stay silent any longer. Clearing her throat, she stepped forward. "Now, Frank," she said, her voice carrying a mix of firmness and grace, "that's enough. Mr. Musk is a customer, and he deserves the same respect as anyone else who walks through these doors." The room fell silent, all eyes on her. Ruby's heart pounded, but she stood her ground, her gaze steady on Frank. "You all know me," she continued, her voice soft but resolute. "I've worked here for years, and I've always treated everyone with kindness. I'd like to think we can extend the same courtesy to anyone who comes in, no matter who they are." For a moment, the cafe was still. Then, Frank muttered something under his breath and returned to his seat, his expression sour. Elon met Ruby's eyes, a glimmer of gratitude in his own. "Thank you," he said softly, but the moment was short-lived. The owner, Mr. Smith, emerged from the back, his frown deepening as he surveyed the scene. "Ruby," he said, his voice clipped, "can I see you in the back for a moment?" Ruby's stomach sank, but she nodded, following him into the small office. When she returned a few minutes later, her face was pale. The regulars watched her in silence, sensing something had changed. Ruby avoided their gazes as she walked to the counter, her hands trembling slightly. She didn't need to say it out loud. They all knew. The cost of defending Elon Musk had been her job. What happens to Ruby next will leave you speechless. Don't miss the next chapter of this incredible story. Stay tuned and leave a comment about what you think of her courage so far. The night air felt colder than usual as Ruby Carter stepped out of Poppy's cafe, the weight of her termination pressing heavily on her shoulders. She clutched her purse tightly, the contents now including her last paycheck, handed to her with a mixture of pity and regret from Mr. Smith. "Ruby, you've been a good worker, but we can't afford to alienate customers," he had said, his tone dismissive. "You brought this on yourself." The words echoed in her mind as she walked down the dimly lit street. The once familiar town felt foreign, its warm glow now tainted by humiliation and uncertainty. Ruby had faced challenges before, raising 3 children as a widow, enduring the sting of prejudice, and working long hours to make ends meet. None of it had broken her spirit. But tonight, she felt the weight of the years more acutely than ever. As she rounded the corner, a sleek black Tesla silently rolled up beside her. The window lowered, and a familiar face appeared. Elon Musk. "Mrs. Carter," he called out, his voice gentle. Ruby stopped, startled. "Mr. Musk? What are you doing here?" "I saw what happened back there," he said, his brow furrowed with concern. "I couldn't just let you walk away like that." Ruby's cheeks flushed with a mix of embarrassment and frustration. "Well, you don't have to worry about me," she said, her voice firmer than she felt. "I'll manage, like I always have." Elon hesitated, then gestured to the passenger seat. "Please, let me give you a ride home. It's the least I can do." Ruby stared at him for a moment, debating whether to accept. Finally, she nodded, her pride giving way to exhaustion. "All right," she said quietly, climbing into the car. The ride was silent at first, the hum of the electric motor the only sound between them. Ruby stared out the window, her mind racing. What did this man, this billionaire, know about struggle? About loss? "You stood up for me," Elon said finally, breaking the silence. "That took courage." Ruby glanced at him, her expression weary. "It wasn't about courage," she replied. "It was about doing what's right. Something my mama taught me a long time ago." Elon nodded, his gaze thoughtful. "Still, not many people would have done what you did. You put yourself on the line for a stranger." Ruby shrugged. "I've been on the other side of that kind of treatment. I know what it feels like to be judged before anyone even knows your story." They pulled up in front of Ruby's modest home, a small, weathered bungalow she had lived in for over 40 years. She hesitated before opening the door, turning to face Elon. "Thank you for the ride," she said, "but I'll be fine. I've been through worse." Elon smiled faintly. "I don't doubt that for a second," he said, "but I'd like to help, if you'll let me." Ruby frowned. "Help how?" "I don't know yet," he admitted, "but someone like you shouldn't have to face this alone. You've earned more respect than the world seems willing to give you." Ruby studied him for a moment, her sharp eyes searching his face for any sign of insincerity. Finding none, she nodded slowly. "All right, Mr. Musk," she said, her tone measured. "If you think you can help, I'll hear you out." As she stepped out of the car and walked to her front door, Ruby felt a flicker of something she hadn't felt in years, hope. Inside, as she locked the door and leaned against it, she allowed herself a moment to breathe. Tomorrow was uncertain, But tonight, she had made a stand. And perhaps, just perhaps, she wouldn't face the consequences alone. Ruby's decision to trust Elon Musk will lead her to an unexpected turn of events. What could this billionaire have in mind? Stay tuned for the next chapter and share your thoughts on Ruby's resilience below. The next morning, Ruby Carter sat at her small kitchen table, her hands wrapped around a steaming mug of coffee. The aroma filled the air, but its warmth did little to soothe the knot of anxiety in her chest. The events of the previous evening still played in her mind like a reel on repeat. Elon Musk showing up in a sleek car, offering his help? It felt surreal. She shook her head, trying to make sense of it. What could a man like that possibly want with me? She muttered under her breath. A sudden knock at the door jolted her from her thoughts. Ruby's brow furrowed as she stood, her movements slow but deliberate. Visitors weren't a common occurrence, especially not this early. When she opened the door, she was met with the sight of a man in a sharp black suit, his demeanor professional but not unfriendly. Behind him, a black SUV idled at the curb. "Mrs. Carter?" the man said, his voice smooth. "Yes?" Ruby replied cautiously, her grip tightening on the doorknob. "I'm with Mr. Musk's team. He asked me to deliver this personally." The man held out a crisp envelope, the kind that spoke of importance before it was even opened. Ruby stared at it for a moment, then reached out with trembling fingers. "What's this about?" "He'll explain everything," the man assured her with a polite smile. "There's a car waiting to take you to him, if you're available." Ruby blinked, taken aback. A car? A personal invitation? She glanced down at her modest housecoat and slippers, feeling suddenly self-conscious. I wasn't expecting company," she stammered. "Take your time," the man said, stepping back to give her space. "We can wait as long as you need." Ruby nodded, closing the door gently. Her heart raced as she made her way back to her room. She chose her Sunday best, a navy blue dress she hadn't worn in years, and carefully fixed her hair, her hands steady despite the flurry of nerves. When she finally stepped outside, the man opened the car door for her, and she slid onto the plush leather seat. The SUV's interior was luxurious, unlike anything Ruby had experienced before. The drive was quiet, giving her time to think. What did Elon Musk want? Why was he going to such lengths? The car pulled up to a sleek office building downtown, and Ruby was ushered inside. She marveled at the modern decor, the pristine glass walls, and the hum of productivity in the air. At the top floor, the elevator doors opened to reveal a spacious office bathed in sunlight. Elon Musk stood by the window, his hands in his pockets. He turned as Ruby entered, his expression warm. "Mrs. Carter," he greeted, stepping forward. "Thank you for coming." Ruby offered a small smile, her posture straight. "I'm not sure why I'm here, Mr. Musk, but I figured it must be important." Elon gestured to a seat across from him. "Please sit. I wanted to talk to you about what happened last night and what comes next." Ruby sat cautiously, her eyes narrowing slightly. "What do you mean, what comes next?" Elon leaned forward, his tone earnest. "I believe in rewarding integrity, Mrs. Carter. You showed tremendous character, standing up for what's right, even when it cost you. People like you inspire change, and I want to be a part of that." Ruby tilted her head, skepticism creeping into her voice. "And how exactly do you plan to help me?" He smiled faintly, a glimmer of determination in his eyes. "First, I'd like to offer you a position. You've got experience, wisdom, and a perspective the world needs more of. I could use someone like you on my team." Ruby blinked, stunned. "You're offering me a job?" "Not just any job," Elon clarified. "I want you to be part of a community initiative we're launching. Something that uplifts people like you who've spent their lives making the world better without getting the recognition they deserve." Ruby's heart raced as she tried to process his words. Was this real? Could it be possible that her small act of standing up for justice had led to such an opportunity? As Elon outlined the details, Ruby felt a spark reignite within her, a sense of purpose she hadn't felt in years. This wasn't just about a job. It was about a chance to make a difference on a scale she'd never imagined. Ruby's journey is just beginning, but will she embrace this new chapter of her life? Stay tuned to see how her decision unfolds, and share your thoughts on her incredible turn of fortune below. Ruby sat quietly in the back of the luxurious SUV as it carried her home. The conversation with Elon Musk had been more overwhelming than she could have anticipated. His offer, a job that would allow her to mentor and inspire others while contributing to meaningful community projects, was unlike anything she had ever considered. As the car pulled up to her modest house, Ruby stepped out, thanking the driver with a polite nod. She lingered on the porch, her eyes scanning the familiar surroundings. Her worn rocking chair sat by the door, the garden she'd carefully tended for years blooming in vibrant colors. This was her life, a simple, steady routine. Could she really leave it behind? Inside, Ruby placed the envelope Elon had given her on the kitchen table. She hadn't opened it yet. Part of her feared what might be inside. A contract, maybe, or some kind of formal agreement. It felt too surreal, too distant from the life she knew. She poured herself another cup of coffee, the act grounding her as she sat down. Taking a deep breath, she opened the envelope. Inside was a handwritten note from Elon himself, thanking her for her courage and outlining the position in more detail. Along with the letter was a check, a sizable amount, labeled as an advance for her first project. Ruby's eyes widened as she read the figure, her heart pounding. The money could change her life, fix the leaking roof, pay off her lingering medical bills, maybe even set aside something for her grandchildren's futures. But the job wasn't just about the money. It was about stepping into a world she'd never known, one full of challenges and possibilities. The ringing of the phone startled her. She reached for it, her hand trembling slightly. "Hello? Grandma Ruby, it's me, Tasha." Her granddaughter's cheerful voice came through. Ruby's face softened. "Hey, baby. How are you?" "I'm good. Mom told me what happened at the diner. Are you okay?" Ruby chuckled softly. "I'm fine, sweetheart. Things got a little heated, but it all worked out. Mom said you stood up for some guy, and it turned out to be Elon Musk. That's so cool." Tasha's voice bubbled with excitement. "You're like a hero, Grandma." Ruby smiled, her chest tightening. "I just did what was right. That's what I've always taught you, haven't I?" "Yeah, but now you're famous. Mom says everyone's talking about it online." Ruby's smile faltered. The idea of being the center of attention unnerved her. She had lived her life quietly, without seeking recognition. "Listen, Tasha," Ruby said, changing the subject. "I've been offered an opportunity, and I need your advice." "Of course, Grandma. What's up?" Ruby hesitated, then explained the offer, omitting the details of the check for now. When she finished, Tasha let out a low whistle. "Wow, that sounds amazing. But how do you feel about it?" "I don't know," Ruby admitted. "It's exciting, sure, but it's also intimidating. I've been living the same way for so long. Starting something new at my age, it feels risky." "Grandma, you're the strongest person I know," Tasha said, her voice steady. "If anyone can handle this, it's you. And think about the difference you could make. You've always said the world needs more kindness and courage. This is your chance to spread that." Ruby's chest tightened again, this time with a swell of pride. "You always know just what to say, don't you?" Tasha laughed. "I learned from the best." After they hung up, Ruby sat in silence, her thoughts swirling. She looked at the check again, then at the letter. She had spent her life putting others first, her family, her neighbors, her community. Was it time to step forward and take this chance for herself? As Ruby grapples with this life-changing decision, will she find the courage to embrace the unknown? Don't miss the next chapter, where Ruby takes her first steps into a world of opportunity and challenges. Let us know what you think Ruby should do in the comments below. The sun cast its first golden rays over the neighborhood as Ruby stood by her kitchen window, cradling a warm cup of coffee. She'd barely slept, her mind circling endlessly around the decision she needed to make. Elon Musk's offer felt like a crossroads, one path leading to a comfortable, familiar life, and the other to a future she could barely comprehend. She glanced down at the letter and check still sitting on the table. The possibilities were endless, but so were her fears. What if she wasn't good enough for this new role? What if stepping into this unfamiliar world left her feeling out of place and overwhelmed? A knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. Ruby hesitated, setting her mug down before heading to answer it. Standing on her porch was Pastor Wallace, a kind-hearted man who had been a source of support for Ruby over the years. "Good morning, Ruby," he greeted with a warm smile. "Hope I'm not disturbing you too early." "Not at all, Pastor." "Come in," Ruby said, stepping aside. Pastor Wallace entered, his eyes scanning her face. "You look like you've got something weighing on your mind." Ruby gestured to the kitchen table, where the letter and check lay. "I've got a big decision to make, and I don't know if I have the courage to follow through." The pastor took a seat, adjusting his glasses as he picked up the letter. He read it carefully, his expression shifting from curiosity to admiration. "Well, he said, leaning back in his chair. "This is quite the opportunity, Ruby, but it's also understandable to feel uncertain. Stepping into the unknown is never easy." Ruby sighed, sitting across from him. "I'm not sure I'm the right person for this, Pastor. I've lived a simple life. What do I know about big corporations or community initiatives on this scale?" Pastor Wallace chuckled softly. "Ruby, you've been a pillar of this community for decades. You've helped raise not just your own children and grandchildren, but also supported countless others through your kindness and wisdom. That's exactly what they're looking for. Someone who understands the struggles of everyday folks and knows how to make a real difference." Ruby's gaze dropped to her hands. "But what if I fail? What if I'm not enough?" The pastor reached across the table, placing a reassuring hand over hers. "Failure isn't the worst thing, Ruby. Not trying, that's what leaves us with regrets. And from what I've seen, you're more than enough for any challenge that comes your way." Ruby smiled faintly, her heart lifting just a little. "You always know how to give me the push I need." "That's what I'm here for," Pastor Wallace said, rising to his feet. "Now, whatever you decide, know this. You've already inspired so many people by just being who you are. Whatever path you choose, the impact you've made won't fade." Ruby walked him to the door, watching as he disappeared down the street. She felt lighter, but still hesitant. Her thoughts returned to Tasha's words the night before. "Think about the difference you could make." Ruby exhaled deeply. She'd always told her grandchildren to face life with courage and an open heart. Now it was time to live by her own advice. She returned to the table, picked up her phone, and dialed the number Elon Musk had left in the letter. A woman's voice answered. "Good morning. You've reached Mr. Musk's office. How may I assist you?" "This is Ruby Carter," she said, her voice steady despite the butterflies in her stomach. "I'd like to speak with Mr. Musk, please." "One moment, Miss Carter," the assistant replied. Ruby's heart raced as she waited, the seconds stretching out endlessly. Finally, Elon's familiar voice came through the line. "Ruby, I hoped I'd hear from you." She smiled, a surge of confidence washing over her. "I've made my decision. I'm in." Ruby has taken the first step toward an incredible new journey, but what challenges and surprises await her in this bold new role? Join us in the next chapter as Ruby steps into a world unlike any she's ever known. Let us know in the comments what you think Ruby's first project might be. Ruby hung up the phone, her heart still pounding from the conversation. She could hardly believe what she had just done. She had agreed to step into an entirely new world, one that seemed miles away from her small-town life. It felt like stepping off a cliff, trusting that the ground would somehow catch her. But the moment the decision was made, Ruby felt a shift within herself. There was something exhilarating about knowing that she had chosen to take control of her future. She wasn't just going to sit by and watch life pass her by. She was going to dive in headfirst and see where it took her. The next few days felt like a blur of activity. The office sent her a car service to take her to a meeting at one of Elon Musk's companies. Ruby could hardly believe it. She, Ruby Carter, was going to meet with some of the wealthiest and most influential people in the world. As the sleek black car pulled up in front of a towering glass building, Ruby felt a flutter of nerves. The architecture was unlike anything she had ever seen. It was pristine, modern, and intimidating. She looked at herself in the rearview mirror, trying to adjust her dress and make sure her hair was neat. For a moment, she wondered if she belonged in this world of suits and polished shoes. When she stepped out of the car, a man in a sharp suit greeted her with a warm smile. "Miss Carter, welcome." We've been expecting you. He led her into the building and up to an elevator that whisked them to a floor so high, Ruby could see the entire city sprawled beneath her. The doors opened to a sleek, minimalist office. A large desk sat at the center of the room, and behind it was Elon Musk, standing with his arms extended in greeting. His expression was kind, but there was an intensity in his eyes that made Ruby feel both nervous and honored. "Ruby, thank you for coming," Elon said, his voice warm but with an undercurrent of urgency. "I know this is a big leap for you. I'm really excited to see what you'll bring to the table." Ruby swallowed her nerves and smiled back. "Thank you for this opportunity, Mr. Musk. I have to admit, I'm a little overwhelmed, but I'm ready to try." Elon chuckled, as if he'd anticipated her apprehension. "You're not here to try, Ruby. You're here to make a difference. We need someone who can think outside the box, someone who isn't caught up in corporate norms." Ruby nodded, her confidence slowly building. "I've spent my life helping people in my community, whether it's offering advice or lending a hand. I think I can bring that same spirit of service here." "Exactly," Elon said, walking around the desk to stand beside her. "We've got big plans for the future, and we need someone who understands people, not just numbers. You'll be the bridge, Ruby. You'll be the one who helps us remember why we're doing all this in the first place." Ruby looked out the window, taking in the vast city beneath her. The view was awe-inspiring, but it wasn't the buildings or the skyline that captured her attention. It was the feeling of being part of something larger than herself, a feeling she had never experienced before. Elon continued, "Your first task is going to be tricky, but I believe you can handle it. We're starting a new initiative focused on giving back to communities that have been underserved. We need someone who can connect with people on the ground level, who knows what it's like to be left behind." Ruby's heart beat faster. This was what she had dreamed of doing her entire life, helping people, making a tangible impact. But now it was real, and the weight of the responsibility felt heavy. "I'm ready," she said, surprising herself with the strength in her voice. "I'll do whatever it takes." Elon smiled. "I knew I picked the right person." As the meeting concluded, Ruby was handed a packet of materials, details about the new initiative, contacts, and plans for the first community event. It was a lot to absorb, but the excitement that surged through her made it feel possible. On her way out of the building, Ruby realized that the world she had just stepped into was nothing like she had ever imagined. The challenges ahead would be immense, but so were the rewards. She didn't know exactly where this journey would take her, but one thing was clear. She was going to change lives, starting with her own. Ruby has taken the first step in her new journey, but what challenges will she face as she tries to navigate this world of wealth and power? Will she succeed in bringing change to the communities that need it most? Stay tuned for the next chapter to see how Ruby rises to the occasion. What do you think Ruby's first move should be? Share your thoughts below. Ruby sat at the sleek, modern desk in her small apartment, staring at the packet of materials Elon had handed her. The initial rush of excitement had worn off, leaving behind the cold, hard reality of what she had just agreed to. She was now responsible for an initiative that could affect the lives of countless people, and the weight of that responsibility was heavy. She glanced at the clock on her wall. It was late. The city outside her window was alive with lights, but inside, all she could hear was the hum of her thoughts. There were so many questions swirling in her mind. Where did she even begin? How could she possibly live up to Elon's expectations? Her phone buzzed on the desk. It was a message from her old friend Linda. "Linda, Ruby, you all right? Haven't heard from you in a while. I know things have been crazy with that job offer, but just checking in." Ruby smiled as she read the message. Linda had been her closest friend for years, and despite the new direction her life was taking, she still needed that connection to her past. She quickly typed back a response. "Ruby, hey Linda. I'm doing all right, just overwhelmed. This new role is a lot more than I expected, but I'm figuring it out. I'll call you tomorrow." She hit send and set the phone aside. Her mind wandered back to the task at hand. The community initiative. She had been chosen because of her understanding of people, of struggle, of what it meant to be left behind. But the scale of it all was daunting. This wasn't just about helping a few people. This was about changing the landscape of entire neighborhoods, transforming lives, and making sure the resources got to those who needed them most. Ruby's phone buzzed again, this time with an incoming call. It was Elon. "Ruby, I've been thinking about our conversation earlier. I know this is a lot to take on, but I believe in you." Elon's voice came through clearly, as if the distance between them didn't exist. "Thank you, Mr. Musk," Ruby replied, her voice steady despite the nervous flutter in her chest. "I want to do my best. It's just a lot to process." "I get it," he said, "but I'm not worried about you. You've got heart, Ruby. What you need now is a plan. So, I want you to start thinking about the communities that matter most, those that have been forgotten by most of society. Your first step should be identifying the areas that need the most help." Ruby nodded as if he could see her, even though she was sitting alone in her apartment. "I've already been thinking about that. There are neighborhoods in this city where people are just surviving, barely. It's like they're invisible to the rest of the world. I want to start there." "Good," Elon said, his voice firm but encouraging. "Get to know those communities. Connect with the leaders on the ground, people who are already doing the work. You don't have to reinvent the wheel. Just figure out how we can support them better." Ruby took a deep breath. "I can do that. I'll start reaching out to local leaders tomorrow." Elon's voice softened. "I'm glad you're on board, Ruby. But remember, this isn't just about resources. It's about trust. People have to believe that you're there for them. So, don't just show up with ideas. Show up with the intention to listen, to learn. And don't be afraid to challenge the status quo." Ruby's heart swelled with determination. This was why she was here. Not to just fix things from the top down, but to make sure that the people who had been left behind were heard and seen. "I'll remember that," she said, her voice resolute. After the call ended, Ruby sat back in her chair, feeling the weight of the next few days pressing down on her. But for the first time, she wasn't overwhelmed by it. She was ready to dig into the work, to meet with the people who had been overlooked, to listen to their stories. Her phone buzzed once more, but this time it was a reminder from the calendar app, meeting with local leaders tomorrow at 10 a.m. Ruby stood up and walked over to her window, looking out at the city once again. The skyline was beautiful, but it felt like it was miles away from the reality of the people she had promised to help. She knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. It would take time, patience, and a willingness to face uncomfortable truths. But she wasn't backing down. She had a purpose now, and she was going to fight for it. Ruby has begun her journey to bring real change to the communities that need it most. Will she be able to gain the trust of the people she's trying to help, or will she face resistance? What challenges will she encounter next as she strives to balance her new role with her passion for the cause? Stay tuned for the next chapter to find out. What do you think Ruby's biggest challenge will be? Share your thoughts below. The morning sun filtered through the blinds of Ruby's apartment as she dressed in a simple blouse and slacks. Today was the day she would take her first real step toward understanding the communities she aimed to help. She had made the decision to meet with several local leaders who had been fighting for change long before her involvement. People who had lived through the struggles and had never given up. As she packed a small notebook and pen into her bag, her phone buzzed. It was a text from Linda again. "Linda, so, you ready for your big day?" Ruby smiled. She appreciated her friend's constant support, even from afar. "Ruby, I think so. I'm nervous, but I'm ready to listen and learn." With a deep breath, Ruby locked the door behind her and made her way down to the street. She caught a cab to the meeting spot, a community center in a neighborhood that, from her research, had been struggling with unemployment, lack of resources, and systemic neglect for years. This was where she would meet those who had been doing the heavy lifting. The community activists, the local leaders, the ones who knew the true needs of the people she wanted to help. The center was a modest building, a little worn around the edges, but it buzzed with energy. People were talking, shaking hands, and preparing for the day ahead. Ruby stepped inside, immediately feeling the difference from the sterile, polished world she had been living in. This was real. These people were living and breathing the struggles she had only read about. A woman who looked to be in her mid-40s walked up to her. She was tall, with a commanding presence and a warm smile. "You must be Ruby." "I'm Tasha," the woman said, extending her hand. "We've heard a lot about you. Thanks for coming." Ruby shook her hand firmly. Thank you for taking the time to meet with me, Tasha. I'm here to learn, and I'm hoping you can help me understand the challenges your community is facing. Tasha gave her a knowing look. You've got your work cut out for you, Ruby. But you're not the first person to try and fix things. The question is, are you ready to listen to the truth? Ruby nodded, swallowing a lump in her throat. I'm ready. The two women sat at a small table surrounded by other community leaders. Ruby took out her notebook, ready to absorb every word. Tasha began speaking, detailing the issues her community had faced for decades. Unemployment had skyrocketed, while schools were underfunded, and crime rates had increased in the absence of support. But that's just the surface, Tasha said, her voice tinged with frustration. The real problem is that people here feel invisible, forgotten by the system. They don't trust the people in power anymore. And that's not something you can fix with money or resources alone. Ruby scribbled notes furiously, her mind racing. She had expected to hear about systemic issues, but the depth of the mistrust hit her harder than she anticipated. She looked around the room, seeing the faces of the leaders who were speaking not just for themselves, but for their entire community. They weren't just asking for help, they were demanding respect. Another leader, an older man named Marcus, chimed in, "It's about dignity. People don't want handouts. They want a chance. They want a seat at the table." Ruby felt the weight of his words, and for the first time, she understood what Elon meant when he said, "People have to believe you're there for them." She had assumed that throwing money at the problem would solve it, but this was bigger than that. "So, where do we start?" Ruby asked, her voice quiet but determined. Tasha smiled faintly. "You start by listening, and then you show up. Don't talk about it, don't promise things. Just show up." Ruby's heart raced. She knew this wasn't going to be easy. She was about to dive into a world of discomfort, of tough conversations and painful truths. But she was here now, and she wasn't going to back down. Ruby spent the rest of the day meeting with more community leaders and activists, hearing their stories and learning about the deep-seated issues they faced. She was exhausted but energized at the same time. By the time she left the community center, it was late, and the streets had emptied. She stood outside, taking in the quiet of the city, her mind flooded with everything she had learned. There was so much to do, so many problems to address. But for the first time since accepting the role, Ruby felt a sense of purpose that went beyond just helping people. This was about restoring dignity, about giving people the power to change their own lives. Her phone buzzed again. It was Elon. "Elon, how's it going, Ruby? Did you meet with the leaders? What did you learn?" Ruby smiled, feeling a new sense of conviction as she typed her response. "Ruby, I learned a lot. This isn't just about handing out money or resources. It's about listening, showing up, and giving people the chance to take control of their own future." She paused for a moment, thinking of all the work ahead. She wasn't sure exactly how she would change the system, but she knew that this was only the beginning. "Ruby, I'm ready. I think I finally understand what needs to be done." Elon's response was simple, but it gave her the confidence she needed. "Elon, I knew you were the right person for the job." As Ruby closed her phone and made her way back to her apartment, she realized that the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but it was the only road worth traveling. She was ready to fight for something bigger than herself. Ruby has taken her first step into the world she wants to help, but the journey has only just begun. Can she build the trust she needs with the community? And what obstacles will she face next as she takes on a challenge greater than anything she's done before? Stay tuned for the next chapter to find out. What do you think Ruby will face next on her path? Share your thoughts below. Ruby awoke to a quiet morning, her mind still swirling with everything she had learned the day before. The weight of the community's struggles lingered with her, but now it was joined by a new sense of responsibility. There were no quick fixes, no easy solutions, and no shortcuts. What she had witnessed the previous day was just the beginning of a long and challenging journey, one that demanded more than just words or money. It demanded real, sustained action. She sat at her kitchen table, a steaming cup of coffee in hand, thinking about the next steps. It was time to meet with more people, local businesses, organizations, anyone who could lend a hand in making the changes she had promised to fight for. But there was something more pressing on her mind: trust. Tasha had been clear when she said, People don't trust the system, and they sure don't trust anyone who comes in with an agenda. How would she break through that barrier? How would she convince the community that she wasn't just another person promising change without following through? As if on cue, her phone buzzed again. Elon, have you made any progress on your next steps? You look a little lost in your thoughts. Ruby hesitated, fingers hovering over the screen. She had never felt this uncertain before. Not in her corporate meetings, not when she was sitting in those boardrooms with the wealthiest people in the world. But this was different. Ruby, I'm trying to figure out how to gain their trust. It's going to take more than just showing up and throwing money around. I need to prove I'm not just here to talk. I need to show them that I'm willing to stand by them, no matter what. Elon, that's the right mindset. But remember, it takes time. Trust isn't built overnight. The first thing you need to do is show that you're one of them, not just an outsider with a good idea. Get your hands dirty. Help without asking for anything in return. Ruby nodded, reading the message as if it were a guidebook. This wasn't about what she could give. It was about what she could do and how she could do it alongside them. Taking a deep breath, Ruby responded. Ruby, I think I know what I need to do. I'm going to start by volunteering at a local food bank. See the real work up close. No press, no fanfare. Just me, helping out where it's needed. Elon, good call. Keep it low-key, and don't forget to listen. People will respect that you're putting in the time. After sending the message, Ruby stood up and grabbed her bag. It was time to start walking the walk, not just talking the talk. She needed to see the impact of the work being done on the ground, not just hear about it. The food bank was a short drive away, and as she pulled up to the small, modest building, Ruby felt the weight of the moment settle on her shoulders. She was stepping into a world where she wasn't the leader, the innovator, or the billionaire philanthropist. She was just another volunteer, one who was trying to make a difference in the only way that truly mattered. Inside, the food bank was buzzing with activity. Volunteers worked quickly, sorting through bags of food, organizing shelves, and preparing for the next wave of families who would arrive to pick up their supplies. Ruby was immediately handed a hairnet and a set of gloves, no questions asked. She didn't need to introduce herself or explain why she was there. She just started working. For the next few hours, Ruby moved between tables, sorting canned goods, packing boxes, and handing out bags of food to families. She didn't speak much. She just did the work that was needed. There was no fanfare, no one asking for her attention, and that was exactly what she needed. But in between the work, she found herself talking to people. A mother who had recently lost her job. An older man who had been living off a small pension for years. A teenager trying to help his single mother care for his younger siblings. Each story was different, but each person had a common thread. A desire for dignity, a wish for a future that was brighter than the present. Ruby listened. She didn't interrupt. She just asked questions, took notes, and kept moving. As the day wore on, the place quieted. The families had left, and the volunteers began to clean up. Ruby stood in the corner, wiping sweat from her brow, when she was approached by one of the other volunteers, a young woman named Anita. You're Ruby, right? Anita asked, smiling. Ruby nodded, brushing a stray hair from her face. That's me. I hope I didn't get in the way today. Anita laughed. Not at all. You did more work than most of us. She hesitated for a moment, then added, I just wanted to say thank you for showing up. A lot of people talk about helping, but not many actually put in the time. Ruby smiled, feeling a sense of warmth in her chest. It's the least I could do. But it's not about what I do. It's about what all of you are doing. I'm just here to learn and help however I can. Anita's smile softened. You're doing more than you think. Ruby didn't know if that was true, but for the first time in a long while, she felt a spark of hope. Maybe, just maybe, this was the beginning of something real. Later that night, Ruby sat in her apartment, reviewing her notes from the day. She had a new sense of clarity. It wasn't going to be easy, and it wasn't going to happen quickly, but she was beginning to understand what needed to be done. The first step was simple. Show up, listen, and do the work. But the second step was just as crucial. Build relationships, one person at a time. She wasn't going to change the world overnight, but she could start by changing the way she approached it. Ruby is starting to understand the hard work that goes into making a difference. But with trust still in the balance, what will she do next to prove her dedication? And who will stand with her when the road ahead gets tough? Tune in for the next chapter as Ruby faces new challenges and discovers that some battles aren't won alone. What do you think her next move will be? Share your thoughts below. Ruby sat at her desk, staring at the open folder in front of her. She had made some progress, real, tangible progress. But it wasn't enough. Not by a long shot. The work she had done so far, the hours spent volunteering, the conversations with the people in the community, were only the beginning. She couldn't stop now. The question still weighed heavily on her mind. How do you turn a single act of goodwill into something that changes a community forever? She'd been in countless boardrooms where the numbers spoke for themselves, where dollars and cents determined the outcome of every conversation. But in this world, in this community, the only thing that mattered was trust. She couldn't buy that. She had to earn it. Her phone buzzed again, snapping her from her thoughts. Elon, you still on track with the food bank? Have you gotten any closer to a solution? She rubbed her temples before typing a response. Ruby, it's not just about the food bank anymore. I've learned that there are bigger issues at play here. People need more than just food. They need jobs, access to education, healthcare. They need a voice. Elon, exactly. That's what I've been telling you. Change takes time, but it starts with people like you. Ruby paused, reflecting on Elon's words. She wasn't used to being told that change started with her. She had always been a part of the larger machine, pulling levers from behind the scenes. But here, in this community, change wasn't something you engineered from afar. It was something you built, brick by brick, with the people who lived in it. Ruby, but where do I start? There's so much to do, and I can't do it all alone. Elon, no one ever does. Start with the people. They have the solutions. You just have to help bring them to the surface. Ruby looked out the window, the city skyline stretching before her. The morning had been calm, but beneath the surface, there was a quiet unrest. People were tired. They were struggling. They were waiting for someone to care enough to fight for them. She knew what she had to do. It was time to get to work. Ruby spent the next several days in constant motion. She visited local schools, met with community leaders, and attended town hall meetings. She listened more than she spoke, and every conversation gave her more insight into the deep-rooted issues the community faced. There were so many things that needed attention. Poor schools, lack of affordable housing, broken roads, and so much more. But Ruby was no longer overwhelmed by the enormity of it all. She had a plan, and the first step was to get people involved. It was early Friday morning when she called a meeting at the community center. She had invited local leaders, activists, business owners, and a few key community members who had already shown a willingness to be part of the solution. When she entered the room, the low hum of conversation stopped, and all eyes turned to her. She took a deep breath and stepped up to the front of the room. "Thank you all for coming today," Ruby began. "I know we're all here for one reason, to create change. But let's be clear, this is not about one person. It's about all of us, together, deciding what kind of future we want for this community." She paused, scanning the room. There was skepticism in some faces, hope in others. But Ruby could feel the tension. It was clear that people had been promised change before, only to be let down. They didn't need more empty promises. They needed a plan that would actually work. "We're going to start small," Ruby continued. "We're going to look at the things we can fix right now. Job training, after-school programs, community safety. These are the immediate things we need to address. But we're also going to plan for the long term. Housing, education, healthcare. These things take time, but we have to start somewhere." A woman in the front row raised her hand. "And who's going to pay for all this?" Ruby nodded. "It's a good question, but I'm not asking for charity. I'm asking for an investment. An investment in this community. We can raise funds, partner with local businesses, and get support from government grants. But I need all of you to be involved. This can't be just a top-down solution. It has to come from the ground up." The room was silent for a long moment as everyone took in her words. Finally, a man in the back stood up. "You're right. It's been too long since anyone's cared enough to actually do something. We're in. What do we do first?" Ruby's heart skipped a beat. The response was more than she had hoped for. The room had shifted. The seed of trust was beginning to take root. "We start with the people," Ruby said. "We start with listening, building relationships, and working together. We do it one step at a time, and we keep each other accountable." By the end of the meeting, a plan had begun to take shape. It wasn't perfect, but it was a start. Ruby left the community center with a new sense of purpose. She wasn't alone in this fight anymore. She had a team, and together, they would make things happen. Ruby's phone buzzed again as she walked to her car. "Elon, sounds like things are moving in the right direction. Don't forget, the journey is long. Keep your eyes on the prize." Ruby smiled as she typed back. "Ruby, I won't forget. But I can't do this without them. They're the ones who will make it happen." "Elon, that's the spirit. You're on your way." Ruby took a deep breath, looking out over the city. The long road ahead was daunting, but for the first time, she felt ready to walk it. Ruby is beginning to see the power of community in action. But the path ahead is still uncertain, and the stakes are high. Will the people she's working with stay committed to the cause, or will the challenges be too much? Tune in for the next chapter as Ruby faces her first real test in her quest to change the future of the community. What do you think will happen next? Leave your thoughts below. The following weeks were a whirlwind of meetings, community events, and late-night strategy sessions. Ruby had been working non-stop to rally the people around her plan, but the closer she got to implementing it, the more she realized just how difficult it was going to be to keep everyone on the same page. Some were eager, hopeful that this would be the change they had been promised for years. Others were more skeptical. A few even made it clear they had their own agendas, and it became increasingly clear that Ruby would have to navigate not only the challenges of systemic inequality, but also the complicated dynamics within the community itself. One particular Thursday afternoon, Ruby found herself at the local food bank, overseeing a distribution event. It had become a symbol of their initial efforts, the first visible result of their collective action. But as she watched volunteers unload boxes and hand out bags of food, she couldn't help but feel the weight of the task ahead. The people in line were grateful, of course, but the truth was in their eyes. This wasn't a long-term solution. Ruby's phone buzzed again. "Elon, I hear things are moving forward. How are you holding up?" She sighed, glancing around at the faces in the crowd. "It's a lot harder than I thought. People want change, but change requires more than just good intentions. It's the follow-through that matters, and right now, that's what we're missing." "Elon, change takes time, Ruby. Don't lose sight of that. But it's important to get the right people involved. You need allies you can count on." She thought about that for a moment. She had allies, of course. But the question was, could she rely on them when it really mattered? Ruby was interrupted by a loud shout from across the parking lot. A man in his mid-30s, wearing a black hoodie, was arguing with one of the volunteers. Ruby could see the tension escalating from where she stood. She didn't hesitate. "Excuse me," she said, stepping toward the commotion. The man was shouting, his voice filled with frustration. "You people think you can just hand out food and everything will be fine? It's a joke. You don't even know what we really need." Ruby approached him slowly, her presence calm but firm. "What do you need, sir?" she asked. The man glared at her, his chest heaving. "You're giving us scraps. That's what you're doing. What I need is a real chance. A job. A way to get out of this mess." Ruby nodded, acknowledging the truth of his words. "I hear you, and we're working on that. But it's going to take time. We're laying the groundwork for something bigger. Right now, though, we're doing what we can to make sure no one goes hungry." The man shook his head, clearly unconvinced. "Yeah, sure. Whatever." He turned to leave, but Ruby's next words stopped him. "I'm sorry you feel that way," she said, her voice softer now. "But I promise you, we're not going to stop until we've built something that lasts. You may not see it today, but you will. We're working on jobs, education, housing, everything that matters. But you have to trust the process." There was a long pause. The man didn't turn back, but Ruby could tell her words had landed. He was still angry, but perhaps a little less hostile. She wasn't sure if he was convinced, but she knew she had made an impact. That was the beginning. As the event wrapped up, Ruby gathered her team together for a debrief. The mood was heavy. They had fed hundreds of people that day, but Ruby knew it wasn't enough. She had to find a way to keep the momentum going. One of her team members, a young woman named Clara, spoke up. "Ruby, I know we've talked about expanding the program, but we need more support. We need to get the businesses on board. They're the ones who can provide jobs and opportunities. But they're not going to take us seriously unless we show them results." Ruby rubbed her temples, thinking. Clara was right. She needed the local businesses to see the value of investing in the community. Without them, her efforts would be limited. "I'm going to schedule a meeting with the business owners," Ruby said, making a decision. "I'll show them what we've done so far, and I'll ask them for their support. It's time to take this to the next level." The next day, Ruby found herself sitting at a large conference table in the office of a prominent local business owner, Walter Green. He was a wealthy entrepreneur, well respected in the community, but she knew he had a reputation for being a bit cynical when it came to social causes. She had to convince him that investing in the community wasn't just the right thing to do. It was a smart business decision. Walter sat across from her, steepling his fingers. "Ruby, I've been hearing good things about your efforts. But you know as well as I do, these things don't just happen overnight. You're asking for a lot of commitment from people who have their own businesses to run." "I understand that, Walter," Ruby replied. "But what I'm asking for isn't just a donation. I'm asking for an investment. The more we invest in this community, the more we create a thriving local economy. The more people we get off the streets and into jobs, the better it is for everyone. We're not talking about charity here. We're talking about creating a sustainable, self-sufficient community." Walter studied her for a moment before speaking. "You've got passion. I'll give you that. But you're not the first person to come through my door with lofty promises. You'll need to show me more than just talk. You'll need to prove this can work." Ruby nodded, undeterred. "I'm not asking you to take a leap of faith, Walter. I'm asking you to help us build something concrete. You don't have to do it alone. I've already got people lined up, and I know that together, we can create real, lasting change." He leaned back in his chair, considering her words. Finally, he spoke. "All right, I'll agree to partner with you, but we're going to need measurable results. If you can show me that your program works, I'll make a larger commitment." Ruby stood, extending her hand. "I promise you, Walter, we'll deliver. And when we do, you'll see the difference it makes, for everyone." Ruby walked out of the meeting feeling a mix of relief and apprehension. This was the first step in the direction she needed to go. But there was still so much work to do. She had one ally now, but she would need many more to see this through. The test of commitment had begun. Ruby's efforts are starting to gain traction, but the road ahead is filled with obstacles. Will she be able to keep her team and her community united, or will the pressures prove too great? How will she navigate the challenges of securing long-term support from those in power? Stay tuned for the next chapter to find out. The weeks that followed were a blur of meetings, phone calls, and late-night strategy sessions. Ruby was starting to feel the weight of the responsibility she had taken on. The partnership with Walter Green, the business tycoon, had given her a glimmer of hope, but it also came with its own set of challenges. Walter demanded results, and he wasn't the only one. Ruby had to prove that the work she was doing wasn't just a temporary fix, but a lasting solution that would benefit everyone, not just the marginalized community she was fighting for. The pressure was mounting, and with each day, it felt like she was running out of time. She spent her mornings attending town meetings and working closely with Clara and her team to secure donations and resources. In the afternoons, Ruby would meet with potential investors, local business owners, and politicians, each conversation more intense than the last. They wanted proof that their money and time would be well spent. But Ruby knew that change didn't come with a simple dollar figure. One Friday afternoon, she met with a local group of influential businesswomen at a cafe. They were eager to hear about the progress Ruby had made, but their questions were pointed and sharp. "Ruby, we're all for helping the community, but we need to know what's going to happen if we put our resources behind this," said Karen, a successful real estate developer. "What's your plan for sustainability?" Ruby's heart pounded in her chest. The weight of their expectations was overwhelming, but she held herself steady. "My plan is to create opportunities. We're not just handing out food or money. We're providing jobs, training, and education. We're developing a network of small businesses that will employ local residents. And we're working with city officials to revitalize the neighborhoods that need it most. Karen raised an eyebrow. And what makes you think people will show up to work? Many of them have never held a job in their lives. Ruby swallowed hard but didn't back down. Because we're not asking for people to just show up. We're offering a chance to change their lives. We're offering hope, and that's something that can drive people like nothing else. There was a pause in the room, and Ruby could feel the tension. Karen looked at the others, then back at Ruby. All right, I like your passion, but we'll need more than just words. I need data, Ruby. Numbers. Projections. I need to see that this can work, not just hear about it. Ruby nodded, taking a deep breath. I can get you that, but I need your help to make it happen. If you want results, I'll need the community's trust, and that means investing in people, not just buildings or programs. You can't build a strong foundation without strong people. The group seemed to relax slightly, but Karen's expression remained skeptical. We'll see, but you better have those numbers soon. As Ruby left the cafe, she felt a sense of accomplishment, but also a nagging feeling in the pit of her stomach. They had listened, but there was still so much more to prove. The pressure was mounting, and with each passing day, the stakes grew higher. Later that week, Ruby was faced with an unexpected challenge. A local journalist named Derek approached her, requesting an interview about her initiative. At first, she was hesitant. Media coverage was a double-edged sword. But Derek was persistent, and he had been following her progress closely. "What's your endgame, Ruby?" he asked during the interview, his voice calm but probing. "How do you plan on convincing the community that this time it's different?" Ruby leaned forward, her eyes locked on his. "I'm not trying to convince anyone. I'm just showing them what's possible. It's not about me or any one person. It's about all of us coming together to make something better. We can't keep waiting for others to solve our problems. We have to be the change we want to see." Derek seemed to consider her words. "That's powerful. But do you think it's realistic? There are a lot of people who are skeptical, who've been burned by promises of change before." Ruby exhaled slowly. "I know. Believe me, I know. But if we don't take this opportunity, then what? Stay stuck? I'm not willing to let that happen." Derek smiled slightly, scribbling notes on his pad. "I'll write this up, Ruby. It's an inspiring story, but we'll need to see some action. People want results, not just good intentions." Ruby left the interview feeling uneasy. It was one thing to have the community's support, but the media's involvement added a layer of complexity. If things didn't work out as planned, it would be hard to escape the scrutiny. The next few days were a blur of frantic phone calls, more meetings, and working on the projections that the businesswomen had requested. Ruby didn't have all the answers, but she knew she had to deliver something, anything, to keep the momentum going. And then, as if the universe was testing her resolve, things took an unexpected turn. One morning, as Ruby arrived at her office, she was greeted by Clara, who looked unusually shaken. "Ruby, we've got a problem." "What is it?" Ruby asked, already bracing for bad news. "The city's mayor," Clara said, her voice tense. "He's pulling back his support. He says we're not delivering results fast enough." Ruby felt the ground shift beneath her. The mayor's backing had been crucial to their efforts. Without him, they were going to lose a significant portion of their funding and political support. "I'll handle it," Ruby said, trying to keep her voice steady. "Let me make a call." Later that afternoon, Ruby sat across from the mayor in his polished office. The man was stern, his expression unreadable. "Ruby, I've heard some concerns from the business community and the press. They're questioning your ability to deliver on the promises you've made. I'm afraid I can't continue supporting something that doesn't have clear, tangible results." Ruby's pulse quickened, but she remained composed. "I understand your concerns, but what I'm asking for is a little more time. We've made progress. We're not just talking about this anymore. People are getting jobs. Businesses are opening. We're building the foundation for something lasting. But it's not going to happen overnight." The mayor's gaze softened for a moment, but his resolve didn't waver. "I'll give you 1 more month, Ruby. But after that, if you don't have clear results, I'll be forced to withdraw my support." Ruby left the mayor's office, her mind racing. The clock was ticking now. There was no more room for error. The clock is ticking, and Ruby's efforts are on the brink of falling apart. Will she be able to deliver the results the community and the mayor are demanding? Or will this be another failed promise? The pressure is on, and Ruby must act quickly to secure the future of her initiative. Stay tuned for the next chapter. The pressure Ruby had been feeling finally began to feel suffocating. Each day seemed like a relentless cycle of meetings, deadlines, and expectations she wasn't sure she could meet. And now, with only 1 month left to prove her initiative's worth, she found herself on the verge of breaking down. Her office, once a sanctuary for planning and strategizing, now felt like a cage. The walls seemed to close in as she tried to balance the community's needs, the demands of her investors, and the looming threat of losing the mayor's support. Ruby sat at her desk, the weight of the situation pressing on her chest. She glanced at the calendar on the wall. Just 25 days left. Her phone buzzed. It was Clara. "Ruby, we need to talk." Clara's voice came through, sounding tense. "What's happened?" Ruby asked, already fearing the worst. "It's not good," Clara replied. "I've heard rumors that some of the businesswomen we were working with are pulling out. They're saying the project's too risky. They've started questioning whether your vision is realistic." Ruby's heart sank. These were the women who had promised to stand by her, who had believed in the change she was trying to create. If they were pulling out, it could mean the end of everything. "I'll handle it," Ruby said, trying to sound more confident than she felt. "Let me talk to them. We can still turn this around." But deep down, Ruby wasn't so sure anymore. The doubts that had been creeping in for weeks were now roaring louder than ever. Later that day, Ruby met with Karen and a few of the other influential businesswomen at a local coffee shop. They sat in a private booth, the air thick with unspoken tension. Ruby took a deep breath and started, her voice steady but with a hint of urgency. "I know there are concerns about the project, but I need you to understand something," Ruby said, her gaze steady. "We're not just building businesses or infrastructure. We're building lives. People are relying on us to create something better for them. I'm not asking for blind faith, but I am asking for time. Time to show that this can work. Time to prove that we can make a difference." Karen folded her arms across her chest, her face unreadable. "Ruby, you know we're all for helping the community, but there are too many uncertainties here. If this doesn't pan out, it'll hurt all of us. We've put our reputations on the line, and we can't afford to risk it any longer." Ruby felt a sting of betrayal, but she didn't let it show. "What do you want me to do, Karen? Walk away? Quit while we're ahead? That's not who I am. That's not who any of us should be." The room was silent for a long moment, and Ruby could see the internal struggle in the eyes of the other women. Finally, Karen spoke again, her voice softer but firm. "We'll give you another 2 weeks, Ruby, but you have to show us something concrete. We need results. We need proof that you can make this work." Ruby nodded, relief washing over her, but it was quickly replaced by the realization of what this meant. She had only 2 weeks left to turn everything around. That night, Ruby couldn't sleep. The ticking of the clock echoed in her mind, louder than ever. She knew time was running out, and if she didn't come up with something soon, everything she had worked for would be lost. She had a small team of people working with her, but they were as stretched thin as she was. They didn't have the resources of the big investors, the name recognition of the business tycoons. All they had was their passion and their belief in the cause. But was that enough? As the early hours of the morning passed, Ruby found herself standing in front of the community center, staring at the building that had come to symbolize everything she was fighting for. It was in worse shape than she had remembered. Peeling paint, cracked windows, a broken sidewalk. It was a reminder of how much work still needed to be done and how little time she had left. Just then, Clara pulled up in her car, looking exhausted but determined. She stepped out and walked over to Ruby. "We're at the breaking point, aren't we?" Clara said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. Ruby nodded. "I don't know how much longer I can keep this up. It feels like every time I take a step forward, something knocks me 2 steps back." Clara placed a hand on her shoulder. "You've come this far, Ruby. You can't give up now. We've got people depending on us, and we can't let them down." Ruby smiled faintly, though it didn't reach her eyes. "I know. but it's getting harder to keep going. The pressure is too much. Clara's eyes softened. You don't have to do this alone. We're all in this together. Ruby sighed, feeling a mixture of gratitude and guilt. She had never wanted to burden anyone with her problems. But now, with everything hanging in the balance, she realized she couldn't do this without help. Thanks, Clara, Ruby said quietly. I don't know where I'd be without you. Clara smiled. You'll never have to find out. The next day, Ruby made a bold decision. She contacted Walter Green, the wealthy investor who had been skeptical of her progress from the start. She had no choice but to face him now, to convince him that she was still worth investing in. When they met, she was surprised by his calm demeanor. He didn't seem angry or frustrated, just patient. You've got 2 weeks, Ruby, Walter said, his voice even. I've seen what you're capable of, but I'm not in the business of throwing money at something that won't work. If you can't show me real progress, I'm out. Ruby swallowed hard. I know. I'm doing everything I can. I've got a plan. It's just that the community deserves more time. They deserve more than just empty promises. Walter studied her for a long moment, then finally nodded. All right, 2 weeks. Show me something concrete, and don't make me regret it. The clock is ticking, and Ruby's options are running out. With only 2 weeks to prove herself, she faces the biggest test of her life. Will she be able to deliver on her promises and secure the future of her initiative? Or will the weight of the pressure finally break her? Stay tuned for the next chapter. The pressure continued to build. Ruby's nights had become a blur of sleepless worry, her days filled with frantic meetings, desperate calls, and one failed idea after another. The 2-week deadline loomed over her like a dark cloud, and the weight of the world seemed to rest squarely on her shoulders. The community that had supported her project from the beginning now felt like a distant dream. They had no idea what she was facing behind closed doors, the whispers of investors pulling out, the rising doubts among her team, the fear of failure creeping in with every passing hour. But Ruby couldn't afford to show any weakness. She had promised them all that this initiative would change their lives, and she was determined to make it happen, no matter what. That morning, as Ruby sat in her office, she received a call from Clara, her voice urgent. Ruby, we've got a problem. The press is getting wind of the rumors about our project falling apart. The local news is planning a piece about the collapse of your initiative. We can't let this go public. Ruby's stomach dropped. The media was a double-edged sword. If they painted her as a failure, it could kill everything. She had to act fast. I'll deal with it, Ruby said, forcing her voice to remain steady. Can you meet me in an hour? We need a plan. The two women met at a small cafe on the edge of town, away from the prying eyes of the press. Ruby had spent the last few hours putting together a strategy, a bold one, but one that might just work. I've got an idea, Ruby said, her tone resolute, but it's risky. Clara raised an eyebrow. Risky how? Ruby leaned in, her voice low. What if we get ahead of the story? What if we invite the media to see the progress we've made, to see the lives we've impacted, and show them that we're not giving up? We need to control the narrative before they can take it from us. Clara was silent for a moment, weighing the idea. That's bold, but it could work. If we can get the right people to back us, show them that we've got more than just plans and promises, we've got results, even if they're small. It might just change the conversation. Ruby nodded, the plan beginning to solidify in her mind. We don't have time to waste. We need to call in every favor, pull together every connection we have. And we need to make the press see what we're really doing here, because if we don't, we're done. Over the next few days, Ruby and Clara worked tirelessly. They called in every favor from local businesses, community leaders, and even a few sympathetic journalists who had followed Ruby's journey from the beginning. They organized a press event at one of the community centers, one of the few projects that had shown tangible progress. It was their last chance. Ruby stood in front of the gathering crowd, her heart pounding. The cameras flashed, capturing her every move as she addressed the press. Clara stood beside her, looking every bit the determined ally she had become. Thank you all for coming today, Ruby began, her voice steady despite the nerves swirling inside her. What you're about to see isn't just about a project. It's about a community that's been overlooked for far too long. It's about the people who have been given the bare minimum, and now they're ready for more. The cameras clicked as Ruby gestured toward the workers and families who had shown up to support the event. They were a testament to what Ruby had fought for. Their lives had been changed by her efforts, even if the bigger picture wasn't yet complete. As she spoke, Ruby could see the skepticism in some of the reporters' eyes. But there were others, those who had been following her story, who were nodding in agreement, who were finally starting to see what she had always believed. She spoke passionately about the vision for the future, about the changes that were already happening, and the ones that were on the horizon. She invited the press to speak with the people whose lives had been impacted by her work, to hear their stories firsthand. When it was over, the press began to ask questions. Questions about timelines, funding, the challenges Ruby had faced. She answered each one as best as she could, holding her ground even when they pushed her hard. But then, as she was about to wrap up, one reporter asked a question that shook her to her core. "Ruby, how can you expect anyone to believe in this initiative when it's already falling apart? Investors are pulling out, and the community is losing faith. What makes you think you can turn this around in 2 weeks?" For a moment, Ruby froze. The weight of the question hung in the air, threatening to undo everything she had worked for. But then, she took a deep breath. "Because I believe in this," Ruby said, her voice clear and unwavering. "I believe in the people who are counting on us. And I believe that we're capable of more than anyone thinks. This isn't just about money. It's about something bigger. And I won't give up until we've seen it through." She could feel the shift in the room. Something had changed. The skepticism remained, but there was a new respect in the air. The reporters who had been questioning her were now listening, considering the possibility that she might just pull it off. Later that evening, Ruby received a call from Walter Green. "Ruby," he said, his tone unreadable, "I saw the press event today. I have to admit, I'm impressed. I wasn't sure if you had it in you, but you've shown me something. We'll give you the 2 weeks. Show us what you can do." It wasn't a victory yet, but it was a chance, a sliver of hope. Ruby had bought herself more time, but now she had to prove that she could deliver. The clock is ticking, and Ruby's fight isn't over yet. With the support of the community and the media, she's managed to hold on, but the real test is still ahead. Can she turn her vision into a reality in time, or will she fall short when it matters most? Stay tuned for the next chapter. The weight of the deadline felt heavier than ever. Ruby's determination had carried her through the last 2 weeks, but the truth was undeniable. Time was running out. The press event had been a lifeline, but now she had to show the world, and herself, that she could follow through. She barely slept, working late into the night, making calls, managing the last-minute details. Her mind raced with all the things that still needed to be done. The investor meeting was scheduled for the following day, and this was it. There would be no more chances. Ruby paced back and forth in her office, a small stack of papers on the desk in front of her, her phone buzzing with updates from the team. She could hear Clara's voice on the other end of the line as she asked for an update. "Everything's in place," Ruby replied, her voice hoarse from lack of sleep. "The presentation is ready. I just need one more push. A final push." "We'll make it happen," Clara said firmly. "You've already done the hard part. Now you just have to believe in it." Ruby wasn't sure if she believed it yet, but she wasn't about to back down now. She had promised this community that she would bring change, and she wasn't going to let them down. The next morning, Ruby arrived at the investor's office with Clara by her side. It felt like the calm before the storm, the quiet moment before everything either fell into place or crumbled. The investors were seated at a large conference table, looking over their notes and paperwork. They barely acknowledged Ruby as she entered, and that stung more than she wanted to admit. The room was cold, the air thick with tension. Ruby stood at the front, Clara standing next to her for moral support. But the words didn't come easily. She had rehearsed this pitch 100 times, but now, faced with the reality of it, it felt like the hardest thing she had ever done. She took a breath, steadying herself. "Good morning, everyone. Thank you for taking the time to meet with me today. I know you have your doubts, and I know the situation hasn't been perfect, but I believe in this, and I believe that we can make it work." Her eyes scanned the room, locking onto the faces of the investors. They were silent, waiting for her to prove it. I'm not asking for more time, she continued. I'm asking for your faith. Faith in the community we've built, faith in the people we've impacted, and faith in the changes we're making. We've seen real progress, even in the face of adversity. This isn't just a project, it's a movement. And if you can't see that, then we're not the right partners. There was a long pause. Clara's hand rested lightly on Ruby's shoulder, offering a silent show of support, but Ruby felt alone in that moment. She had no backup plan, no safety net. This was everything. Finally, one of the investors, a stern man named Gregory, spoke. You've done well to get this far, Ruby, but 2 weeks is a stretch, and we've seen a lot of proposals come through this door. What makes yours stand out? Ruby didn't hesitate. What makes it stand out is the people behind it. They've given everything for this. They've invested their time, their trust, and their hearts. And I will do whatever it takes to honor that. This is about more than just numbers. This is about creating something that lasts. Something that can change lives, not just today, but for years to come. Gregory stared at her for a moment, his eyes unreadable. He exchanged glances with the other investors, and Ruby's stomach churned with the uncertainty of it all. Then, to her surprise, he nodded. You've got a point. We'll give you the funding you need. But this has to be the turning point. No more missteps. This community project has to be everything you say it is, or we walk away. A wave of relief washed over Ruby, but it was quickly replaced by a new weight of responsibility. She had the chance now, but there were no more second chances. The next few days were a whirlwind of activity. Ruby, Clara, and the team worked tirelessly to implement the changes that the investors had requested. Every detail had to be perfect, no more room for errors, no more time to waste. Ruby didn't sleep much. Instead, she poured every ounce of her energy into making this work. And slowly, things began to come together. The community rallied behind them, even more determined now that they had something real to fight for. The media coverage, though still cautious, started to shift. The narrative was no longer about failure. It was about a project that was on the brink of success. By the time the deadline came, Ruby stood at the front of the newly renovated community center, watching as the investors arrived for a final inspection. She could see the surprise in their eyes as they walked through the doors, taking in the progress that had been made in such a short time. One of them, Gregory, approached her with a grin. I didn't think you could pull it off, but I'll be damned, Ruby. You did it. She smiled, but there was no time to bask in the moment. The real work was just beginning. The project has made it through the hardest part, but Ruby knows that it's only the beginning. She's proven herself to the investors, but now she must deliver on the promise she made. With the support of her community and the backing she needs, Ruby is ready for the next challenge. Will she succeed in creating the lasting change she's always dreamed of, or will the pressure become too much? Find out in the next chapter. Ruby stared out of the window of her office, watching the city bustle below. The skyline had always been a symbol of ambition, a reminder that anything was possible if you were willing to fight for it. Now, as the weight of the project settled into her bones, she realized that she was no longer just fighting for herself. She was fighting for every person who had put their trust in her. The past few days had been a blur. The investors had been impressed with the progress, but they had made it clear that this was just the beginning. They wanted results. Real, tangible results. And the pressure was mounting. Ruby took a deep breath and turned back to her desk, where Clara was sorting through the final reports. The moment was slipping away, and she knew she had to seize it before it was gone. Clara looked up at her, a knowing expression on her face. You're thinking about everything at once again. We just got the funding. Let's focus on what's next. Ruby nodded, but her mind was racing. What came next was critical. This project wasn't just a building. It was a lifeline for the people who had been waiting for change. Every decision, every action, would ripple out and affect the lives of those who depended on it. She sat down across from Clara, her eyes scanning the reports. We need to make sure everything is in place for the grand opening. The community needs to see that this wasn't just a one-time investment. This is the start of something big. Clara tapped her pen against the paper. I agree, but we also need to keep the momentum going. It can't stop here. We need to make sure the people see the value in it, that it's more than just a space. It's a foundation for their future. Ruby's heart skipped a beat at the thought. I know. I can't let them down. As the grand opening day approached, Ruby's nerves were at an all-time high. The event had to be flawless. The media coverage was set to be massive, and the eyes of the community and the investors would be on them. It had to be perfect, not just in terms of the building itself, but in how they communicated the impact it would have. The morning of the event, Ruby arrived early, her stomach a bundle of nerves. She paced through the halls of the center, taking in the work that had gone into every inch of the building. The walls were bright with hope, the spaces alive with potential. She saw the people working, putting in the final touches, and felt a sense of pride she hadn't allowed herself to feel before. Clara walked up to her, her eyes bright with excitement. You did it. We did it. Ruby smiled, but the weight of the moment was not lost on her. This wasn't the end. This was just the beginning. The doors opened to a crowd of eager faces, and Ruby stood at the front, ready to speak. She cleared her throat and took the microphone, the silence in the room heavy with anticipation. Today is not just about a building, Ruby began, her voice steady despite the pounding of her heart. Today is about what happens inside of it. It's about the people who will walk through these doors, the families who will find support, and the community that will grow stronger together. We've fought for this, we've sacrificed for this, and we will continue to do so. She paused, letting the words sink in. This is just the start. We've built a foundation, but now it's time to build a future that we all create together. There was a moment of silence before the crowd erupted into applause. Ruby felt a rush of emotion, but she kept her composure. This was what it was all for. This moment, this change. The weeks following the grand opening were a whirlwind. The media coverage was overwhelming, and the positive feedback from the community was even greater than Ruby had expected. The investors were pleased with the progress, but they were already asking about the next steps. Ruby knew that she couldn't stop now. The pressure was still there, but now it was a different kind of pressure. A pressure to deliver, to keep proving that she had what it took to sustain this project long-term. One evening, after another long day of meetings, Ruby sat at her desk, her mind exhausted but determined. The phone rang, and she picked it up without thinking. Ruby. It was Clara. I have some good news. Ruby leaned back in her chair. What is it? The investors want to move forward with Phase 2. They're impressed, and they want to see the project expand. This could be our chance to really make an impact. Ruby's heart raced. This was it. The breakthrough she had been waiting for. The moment she had worked so hard to reach. But she couldn't let herself get too excited just yet. There was still so much to do, so many more hurdles to overcome. But for the first time in a long time, Ruby felt like she could breathe. She had made it this far. And no matter what came next, she was ready to face it head-on. Ruby has fought hard to get to this point, but with the chance to expand the project, the stakes are higher than ever. As she faces new challenges and opportunities, can she maintain the momentum? Or will the weight of her success become too much to bear? Find out in the next chapter. Ruby sat in her office late into the night, staring at the plans for Phase 2. The walls were still filled with the energy of excitement from the grand opening, but now, that energy had shifted. The weight of the next step hung over her like a storm cloud. This wasn't just about building a foundation anymore. This was about cementing a legacy, and the pressure was palpable. The phone buzzed, pulling her from her thoughts. She glanced at the screen. It was Clara. Ruby, we need to talk. Clara's voice was sharp, but Ruby could sense the urgency. What's wrong? Ruby replied, her heart skipping a beat. There's been a setback, Clara said, sounding tense. The city council is pushing back on the zoning permits for Phase 2. They're questioning the environmental impact and the traffic flow. They say it's too much for this area. Ruby's blood ran cold. She had known that bureaucracy was a beast she'd have to tame. But this was a hurdle she hadn't anticipated. The entire project hinged on this expansion. Without it, the grand vision she'd built would crumble like a house of cards. We don't have time for delays, Ruby muttered, pacing back and forth. We've already made so many promises to the community, to the investors. This can't be happening now. I know. Clara said, her voice firm. But we can't ignore it. They want a public hearing. They're going to make us prove that this project is not just necessary, but safe for the community. Ruby clenched her fists, the anxiety rising in her chest. This wasn't the first time she'd faced opposition, but it felt different now. She wasn't just fighting for a building or a business. She was fighting for something larger, something that had the potential to change lives. If she couldn't win this, the impact would reverberate far beyond the confines of this project. Okay, we'll handle this. I'll prepare for the hearing, Ruby said, determination rising in her voice. We'll show them what this project really means for the community. The next few days were a blur of meetings, late-night strategy sessions, and relentless preparation. Ruby and Clara worked tirelessly to gather data, testimonials, and expert opinions to counter the opposition's claims. The hearing was set for the following week, and Ruby knew it would be a battle like no other. On the morning of the hearing, Ruby arrived at the city council chambers, her heart pounding in her chest. The room was packed with city officials, community members, and a handful of journalists, all waiting to see what would happen next. The stakes had never been higher. Ruby stood at the front of the room, facing the council. She had spent hours rehearsing her speech, but now, standing here in the spotlight, the words seemed to fade away. She took a deep breath and began. Good morning, council members. My name is Ruby Lawson, and I stand before you today not just as the founder of this project, but as someone who believes in the future we are building together. This isn't just about a building or a development. It's about the people who will call this place home. It's about families who have waited for years for a chance to live in a community that offers opportunity, safety, and growth. She paused, looking around the room. The council members were listening, but their faces were skeptical. I understand that there are concerns, Ruby continued, her voice steady. There are questions about the environmental impact and the changes to traffic flow. But we have done the work. We have partnered with the best consultants to ensure that every detail is accounted for, every concern addressed. This project will not just be sustainable. It will enhance the community, bringing jobs, resources, and a future for the generations that follow. Ruby's heart pounded, but she kept her composure, leaning into the conviction that had carried her this far. This is not just an investment in brick and mortar. This is an investment in people, in progress, in our shared future. There was a long silence after she finished, the weight of her words hanging in the air. The council members exchanged glances, and Ruby could see the skepticism beginning to fade. But it wasn't over yet. The real test was still to come. As the hearing continued, Ruby fielded questions from the council, defending her vision and proving, time and time again, that this project was not just a dream. It was a necessity. When the final vote was called, Ruby could barely breathe. She stood at the back of the room, holding Clara's hand, both women waiting for the outcome. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the mayor stood and announced, the council has voted in favor of moving forward with the zoning permits for Phase 2. The room erupted into applause, and Ruby felt a rush of relief flood over her. She had done it. The project had passed the final test, and they were one step closer to realizing the vision that had consumed her for so long. As Ruby left the city hall, she stood outside for a moment, letting the cool breeze wash over her. She had won, but the battle was far from over. The real work was just beginning, and the path ahead was still fraught with challenges. But as she looked out at the skyline, she knew that this was her moment. She had fought for this, and now, she was ready to take on whatever came next. Ruby has secured the future of her project, but the journey is far from over. The challenges are only beginning. Will she be able to sustain the momentum, or will the pressure prove too much? Find out in the next chapter. Ruby stood in front of the construction site the following morning, the sun rising behind the skeletal framework of what would one day be the heart of the community. The sight should have been reassuring, proof that all her hard work was paying off, but instead, it felt like a reminder of how much was still at stake. Every brick, every beam, every decision she made now carried the weight of more than just the building. It was about fulfilling promises made to the people who believed in her. She had secured the permits, yes, but there were still so many unknowns ahead. The media had begun to pick up on the project, and with that came scrutiny. People were watching. They were waiting for her to stumble, and Ruby couldn't afford that. She had fought too long and too hard to let this dream slip through her fingers now. Clara joined her at the site, her heels clicking sharply on the pavement as she approached. "Morning," Clara said, scanning the area. "How are you feeling?" Ruby hesitated before answering. "It's a lot. The city's in my corner, but now we've got to prove that we can do this. Not just for the people of this community, but for ourselves, for our own legacy." Clara nodded, clearly understanding the weight of those words. "This project is bigger than all of us, but we've got the right team, and you've got the right drive." Ruby gave her a tight smile. "Thanks, but drive only gets you so far. I need results." They walked together through the site, inspecting the progress. The foundation was taking shape, and the crew was hard at work. But as Ruby looked at the half-built structure, she couldn't help but think of the countless other obstacles waiting around every corner. She checked her phone, reading a text from her financial advisor. The numbers for the first phase were good, but not great. The economy was shifting. People were tightening their belts. That meant she had to ensure that the next phase was flawless. Otherwise, they risked losing the momentum they had worked so hard to build. Ruby made the decision then and there. She would go back to the investors herself. No more relying on middlemen. If they were going to move forward, they needed to feel the urgency she was feeling. The following afternoon, Ruby sat in the sleek boardroom, facing a group of investors who had made their fortunes in everything from technology to real estate. She knew they were used to big risks and even bigger rewards. But this project had the potential to be something different, something personal. "Thank you all for coming," Ruby began, her voice steady but carrying an undercurrent of the determination she felt. "I know we've had our doubts, but I'm here to tell you that this project is going to be a success, not just financially, but culturally. This is our chance to reshape this city, to bring something sustainable, something lasting to the people who need it most." There was a pause as the investors exchanged glances, some skeptical, others intrigued. Ruby knew she had to press forward. "I've heard the concerns about the economy," she continued. "But the people here, they want this. They need this. What we're building is not just a development. It's a chance for this community to thrive. And if we pull back now, if we allow the fear of a downturn to dictate our actions, we will be failing them. And ourselves." A hush fell over the room. Ruby could feel the weight of their eyes on her. It was as if they were waiting for her to break. But Ruby didn't break. She stood tall, her resolve unwavering. "I am asking you for your continued support. We have come too far to stop now. If you stand with me, we will succeed. If you don't, we will fail, not just as a project, but as people who are capable of creating something bigger than all of us." The silence stretched on, longer than Ruby liked. But then, one of the investors, a middle-aged man with a sharp suit and even sharper gaze, spoke up. "I believe in your vision, Ruby," he said, leaning forward. "We're with you. Let's make this happen." A wave of relief swept through Ruby, but she knew better than to relax. She had won a battle, but the war was far from over. The road ahead was still full of pitfalls, and if she wasn't careful, the weight of expectation could crush her. As Ruby left the meeting, she felt a quiet pride. The investors had committed to supporting the next phase, but the challenges she had faced were only going to get tougher. She could already hear the whispers in the background. Naysayers who would never believe in her vision, doubters who would always look for cracks. But Ruby wasn't worried about them. She was worried about the people whose lives depended on this project, the families that would one day call this place home, the workers who would build it, the children who would play in its parks. This wasn't just a development. This was her legacy. Ruby knew that she had secured the support she needed, but the real test was yet to come. She couldn't afford to let her guard down. The pressure was mounting, but it was only pushing her forward. Will Ruby's vision come to fruition, or will the weight of the challenge prove too much? What will she do next to keep the momentum going? Ruby's phone buzzed as she entered the office, the vibrations buzzing through the quiet room. She glanced at the screen, expecting a mundane message from her assistant or a follow-up email from a contractor. But instead, the name staring back at her stopped her dead in her tracks. "Clara." She swiped to answer. "Clara, what's going on?" Her voice on the other end sounded strained. "Ruby, we have a problem. The city council's meeting is today, and there's a vote on the zoning ordinance. They're considering blocking the next phase of your project. Ruby's heart skipped a beat. The city council could make or break everything. She'd been working tirelessly to ensure that their support was locked down, but she hadn't anticipated this kind of sudden pushback. What do you mean, blocked? We've already cleared the zoning issues. Everything was going smoothly. I thought so too, Clara replied, frustration creeping into her voice. But a new council member, one with ties to a local competitor, is leading a charge to stop the project. They've stirred up enough doubt to make it a real issue. Ruby's mind raced. This was the last thing she needed. The vote could go either way, and if the council voted to block the project, it would set them back months, maybe even years. But there was no time to waste. Ruby knew exactly what she needed to do. I'll be there, she said firmly, grabbing her jacket off the back of the chair. We need to fight this now. The city council building was a grand, imposing structure, towering over the neighborhood with an air of authority. Ruby walked through the double doors with Clara at her side, her determination radiating from every step. Inside, the chambers were filled with a mixture of city officials, developers, reporters, and citizens, all watching the proceedings unfold with a sense of anticipation. Ruby's gaze swept across the room, looking for the key players. The mayor, several council members she had worked with in the past, and, most notably, the new council member pushing the opposition. She made her way to the front, where her lawyer was waiting. He nodded at her, his face tight with anxiety. Ruby, we need to act fast. This vote could be close. The opposition is making some strong arguments. Ruby squared her shoulders. I don't care what they say. We've already made a promise to this city, and we're going to keep it. I want a chance to speak. Her lawyer hesitated, glancing over at the council members. It's risky. They might not even let you address the council. They'll let me, Ruby said, her voice sharp. And if they don't, we'll make them. Clara squeezed her arm as a sign of support. Ruby felt a fire burning in her chest, a desire to stand up not just for the project, but for the people whose futures depended on it. She was no longer just fighting for her vision. She was fighting for the very soul of the community. The meeting began, and the room fell silent as the council members filed in. The new council member, Councilman Harper, stood up first, his voice loud and clear as he addressed the room. We've heard from the developers. We've heard from the city officials. But we must ask ourselves, is this project really what's best for the community? There are concerns about the long-term impacts, concerns about the changes this development will bring. Are we ready to sacrifice the soul of our neighborhoods for the sake of profit? Ruby's stomach tightened as she listened. This wasn't about facts anymore. This was about fear and manipulation. And she knew that if the council allowed this kind of rhetoric to dictate their decision, they were setting a dangerous precedent. When it was her turn, Ruby stood and walked to the podium, her heels clicking sharply against the tile. The room grew still, and all eyes turned toward her. The tension was palpable. Ruby took a deep breath before speaking, her voice calm but forceful. I've listened to the concerns, and I understand the fear. But what I'm offering is a chance to build something that lasts, something that brings people together. This project isn't about the developers, and it's not about me. It's about the families who are waiting for affordable housing, the businesses who are waiting for new opportunities, and the children who will one day play in parks that are built by this community. What we are doing is not just construction. It's transformation. She paused, letting her words settle in the room. Then, she continued, her voice unwavering. We've spent years making sure this project is right for the city. We've ensured it benefits everyone, every single person in this room. If we stop now, we send the message that we're not willing to build for the future. We are better than that, and we can do better. Ruby looked directly at Councilman Harper, who was now visibly frowning. I've spent my life building businesses that help people. I didn't come here to walk away from what I started, and I won't. Not today, not ever. I'll fight for this city until the very end. The silence in the room was deafening, and for a moment, Ruby felt like the entire world was holding its breath. Then, a few murmurs began, and one by one, the council members started to speak. They all had questions, some challenging, others supportive, but Ruby could feel the tide shifting in her favor. The vote came soon after, and as the council members raised their hands, Ruby stood on the edge of her seat. The motion passed. The room erupted in applause, and Ruby's heart swelled with relief. It wasn't over, not by a long shot. But today, she had one. As Ruby walked out of the council chamber, Clara by her side, she couldn't help but smile. The battle was far from finished, but this victory, this was proof that if you fought hard enough, you could overcome anything. Will Ruby be able to continue her journey despite the obstacles in her way? What challenges await her next? The euphoria of victory was short-lived. Ruby barely made it back to her office before her phone rang again, this time with an unknown number flashing on the screen. She hesitated for a second before answering, her heart still racing from the council meeting. "Ruby Bennett," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. "Ms. Bennett, this is Sean Fields, a reporter with the City Chronicle. I'm calling about the vote today." His voice was smooth, professional, but there was an edge to it that Ruby didn't like. "I've been doing some digging, and I think there's something you should know." Ruby sat down at her desk, the weight of the conversation hitting her like a truck. "What do you mean?" "There's been talk behind closed doors, talk that the zoning project has been funded by some less-than-legal sources. Sources that might lead to some uncomfortable questions for you." Sean paused, letting the words settle. "I just wanted to give you a heads-up before our report goes live." Ruby's pulse quickened. She had been expecting opposition from the council, but this was something else entirely. Accusations. False accusations. The kind that could tear everything apart. "I don't know where you're getting your information," Ruby said, trying to remain composed. "But I can assure you, everything about this project is above board. I've worked with some of the most reputable people in this city." "I'm sure you have," Sean said, his tone laced with skepticism. "But sometimes, reputation isn't enough. And right now, there's a lot of smoke. The question is, how much fire is there?" Ruby's thoughts raced, a storm of anger and frustration swelling within her. This was exactly the kind of attack she had been dreading, the kind that undermined everything she had worked for. And it was coming from every direction now, the walls closing in on her from all sides. "I can't speak for your sources, but I'm not interested in playing games with the media," Ruby said, her voice cutting through the tension like a knife. "If you have a story, then write it. But don't expect me to entertain rumors." She hung up before he could respond, tossing her phone onto the desk with a sharp click. Clara was right behind her, her face tight with concern. "Is everything okay?" she asked softly. Ruby's gaze hardened as she turned to face her assistant. "We've got trouble. Someone's digging for dirt, and it's not just the council anymore. If this reporter's right, there's a smear campaign coming our way." Clara frowned, stepping closer. "But you've done everything by the book. We've made sure of it, right?" Ruby nodded, but the doubt gnawing at her gut wouldn't let her rest. She had been meticulous. Every deal, every contract, every meeting had been above reproach. Yet, here they were, facing the possibility that all of it might come crashing down. "There's something we're missing," Ruby muttered, pacing the room, "but I need to find out what it is now." Later that night, Ruby sat at her kitchen table, a pile of documents spread out before her. The reports, contracts, emails, all of it. She sifted through them, her fingers moving over the papers like she was searching for a needle in a haystack. Clara had gone home, leaving Ruby alone to deal with the mess. The city's future was riding on this project, and Ruby wasn't about to let it slip through her fingers without a fight. Her phone buzzed again, and she glanced at the screen, almost hoping for some good news. But it was another name she didn't recognize. "Hello?" she answered, her voice weary but alert. "Ms. Bennett, it's Sean Fields again." The reporter's voice came through the line. "I've got something for you, something I think you'll want to see." Ruby's fingers tightened around the phone. "What is it?" "I can't say over the phone, but it's big. It's the kind of thing that could change everything for you. Meet me tomorrow at the park on 5th and Main, 9 a.m. Don't bring anyone with you. Trust me, you'll want to hear this." He hung up before Ruby could respond, leaving her with a mixture of curiosity and dread. Was this a chance to clear her name? Or was it a trap? The next morning, Ruby arrived at the park just as the sun was rising. The air was crisp, the scent of dew still lingering on the grass. She spotted Sean immediately, standing by a bench, his posture tense, as though he was waiting for something or someone. Ruby approached cautiously, her instincts telling her that this meeting was far from ordinary. Sean's eyes flicked to her, and he gave a quick nod. "You came alone," he observed. "I did," Ruby replied, keeping her voice neutral. "What is it you have to show me?" Sean glanced around, ensuring no one else was within earshot, before pulling a folder from his bag and handing it to her. Ruby took it, her fingers brushing the edges of the papers inside. She opened the folder slowly, her heart racing. Inside was a set of bank records, transactions, numbers that didn't make sense at first glance. But there was one name that caught her eye: Ben Jacobs. Ruby's blood ran cold. Ben was a name she had tried to forget. He was an old business partner, someone who had been involved in a series of failed ventures years ago. She hadn't heard from him in years, not since he'd been implicated in a shady real estate deal that had nearly ruined her reputation. "What's this?" Ruby asked, her voice a little too shaky. Sean watched her closely, a knowing look in his eyes. "These transactions came from an account linked to Jacobs. And there's more. This account shows a series of payments made directly to contractors who worked on your project." Ruby's mind reeled. There had to be some mistake. "This can't be true," she whispered, the weight of the implications sinking in. "I haven't worked with him in years. If he's involved in this, You're about to have a very difficult conversation, Ruby," Sean interrupted. "If this story breaks, it won't just affect your project. It'll affect everything you've built." Ruby's heart pounded in her chest. If Ben Jacobs was involved, it wasn't just a smear campaign anymore. This was real. The very foundation of her success was being questioned. She closed the folder, her mind racing as the reality of the situation set in. What would she do next? Would she confront Ben and risk everything, or try to bury the truth before it could surface? The game had changed, and now, Ruby had to decide if she was ready to face the consequences of her past or let her empire crumble. Will Ruby uncover the truth about Ben Jacobs and the shady dealings? Or will this new discovery be the end of her project? Ruby walked back to her car with a heavy heart, the folder still clutched tightly in her hand. Her mind was racing, trying to piece together how Ben Jacobs, someone she thought she had severed ties with long ago, could be involved in her project. She had worked so hard to distance herself from the scandal he had caused years ago, and now, it felt as though all of that work had been in vain. The drive back to her office was a blur. Each traffic light seemed to stretch into eternity, the city around her moving at a pace that felt out of sync with her thoughts. She tried to focus on what she could do next, but the weight of the evidence in her hands was too overwhelming. Ben Jacobs was a ghost from her past, and now he was threatening to destroy everything she had worked for. By the time Ruby stepped into her office, the sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the room. Clara looked up from her desk, her expression immediately shifting from neutral to concerned. "Ruby, are you okay?" she asked, standing up. "You look shaken." Ruby didn't answer immediately. She set the folder on her desk, her hands trembling as she sat down in the chair. Clara didn't push, but the silence between them spoke volumes. Ruby had always been strong, always had the answers. But right now, she felt like she was losing control. "I need you to do something for me," Ruby said after a moment, her voice quieter than usual. Clara raised an eyebrow. "Anything? Find out everything you can about Ben Jacobs. Every detail, every transaction, every connection to the contractors who've worked on this project. I need to know how deep this goes." Ruby paused, her fingers drumming nervously on the desk. "And I need it done by tomorrow." Clara nodded, though there was a flicker of hesitation in her eyes. "Of course. I'll get started on it right away. But Ruby, are you sure about this? It sounds like this could get ugly." Ruby's gaze hardened. "It already is ugly. I just didn't realize how much until now." With that, Clara left, and Ruby was left alone with her thoughts. The darkness outside mirrored the storm inside her. The weight of the decision ahead of her pressed down on her chest. She could feel it. Her life was teetering on the edge of something dangerous. The following morning, Ruby barely slept. Her mind was consumed by thoughts of Ben Jacobs and the mess she was about to uncover. She knew she had to confront him soon. If there was any truth to the claims Sean Fields had made, then Ben was the key to everything. By the time Clara returned with the information, Ruby was already pacing the office, unable to focus on anything other than the impending confrontation. Clara walked in quietly, holding a stack of papers. "I did a deep dive on Jacobs," Clara said, dropping the papers onto the desk. "It's worse than we thought." Ruby's heart sank. "What do you mean?" Clara looked her in the eye. "Ben Jacobs has been using shell companies to funnel money into contractors linked to your project. The same contractors who've been helping with the zoning work. He's got his fingerprints all over this." Ruby's blood ran cold. She picked up the papers, scanning the documents quickly. Clara was right. There were clear links between Ben Jacobs and the contractors, and the timeline matched up with the initial stages of her project. The payments, the meetings, the backdoor deals. It was all right there in black and white. "This is bad," Ruby muttered, dropping the papers back onto the desk. "If this goes public, I'll lose everything. My reputation, the project, everything." Clara hesitated before speaking again. "Ruby, you need to decide what you're going to do. Confront him now, or bury this and pretend it doesn't exist. But I'll be honest with you. If you let it go, it's going to haunt you." Ruby stared at the papers, her mind racing. Burying the truth wasn't an option. She couldn't go down that path again, not after everything she had built. But confronting Ben, someone who had been so tangled in her past, wasn't a choice she was prepared to make lightly. She needed answers, and she needed them now. "I'll confront him," Ruby said, her voice steady despite the storm inside her. "But I'm going to do it on my terms. I'll meet him today, and I'll make it clear that he's not going to destroy me." Clara gave her a nod of support. "I'll be here, no matter what happens." That afternoon, Ruby drove to a nondescript office building on the outskirts of the city where Ben had his headquarters. The building looked as empty as it felt inside. There was a coldness to the space, as though no one had bothered to care about the facade of professionalism. The walls were barren, the air stale. Ruby felt a chill crawl up her spine. She walked to the elevator, her heels clicking loudly against the marble floor. When the doors opened, Ben was already waiting for her, his posture relaxed, but his eyes sharp. He had always been good at pretending to be harmless, but Ruby knew better. "Ruby," Ben said with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "I was wondering when you'd show up." She didn't return the smile. "Cut the act, Ben. I know what you've been doing." His expression flickered for a moment, but he quickly recovered. "What are you talking about?" Ruby pulled the folder from her bag and slammed it down on the table between them. "This. You've been using shell companies to launder money through contractors connected to my project. I know everything." Ben didn't flinch. Instead, he leaned back in his chair, looking almost amused. "You think you know everything, Ruby? You don't. There's more at play here than you realize." Ruby's anger flared, but she held it in check. "I'm giving you one chance to explain yourself. If you don't, I'm going straight to the authorities. You know what happens then." Ben sighed, his smile finally fading. "You're playing a dangerous game, Ruby. I hope you're ready for the consequences." The tension in the room was palpable as Ruby waited for Ben to speak. Would he admit to what he had done, or would he keep his silence and force her hand? The stakes had never been higher. Will Ruby be able to expose Ben and salvage her project, or will the web of lies unravel her empire? Ben leaned forward, his fingers steepled in front of him as he regarded Ruby with a cold, calculating gaze. The room felt smaller now, the silence stretching between them like a taut wire ready to snap. Ruby's heart pounded, her mind racing with possibilities. She had to outsmart him, but she couldn't afford to be reckless. She needed him to slip up. "You don't get it, do you, Ruby?" Ben's voice was soft, almost patronizing, as if he were talking to a child. "This isn't just about money or power. It's about survival. You're too naive to see the bigger picture." Ruby's eyes narrowed. "Cut the nonsense, Ben. If you think you're going to talk your way out of this, you're mistaken." He chuckled, but it was a hollow sound. "I don't need to talk my way out of anything. You're in deep, Ruby. Deeper than you realize. If you bring this to light, It won't just be my reputation on the line. It'll be yours, too. This project? Your whole empire? It's all connected. You've been playing the game, but you don't even know the rules. Ruby clenched her fists. The words hung in the air like a heavy fog. She had suspected there was more to this than just financial corruption, but hearing Ben say it so bluntly sent a chill down her spine. If he was telling the truth, the consequences of exposing him would be devastating. But she couldn't back down now, not after everything she had sacrificed to get here. I didn't come here to listen to your threats, Ruby said, her voice steady despite the turmoil inside her. I came to stop you. So, here's the deal, Ben. You can either walk away from this and leave me and my project alone, or I expose everything. Your choice. Ben leaned back in his chair, a smile playing at the corners of his lips. It wasn't a smile of amusement. It was a smile of someone who knew something Ruby didn't. You think you have the upper hand, don't you? He asked. You think that if you expose me, you win. But you're wrong. You'll destroy everything you've worked for in the process. You'll be known as the woman who tried to take down a powerful man and failed. And I'm not the only one in this city who plays dirty. Ruby's stomach tightened. He wasn't bluffing. She knew it. Ben had connections, powerful ones, and if he was right about the scope of what was at stake, her entire life could come crashing down. But there was no turning back now. I'm not afraid of you, Ruby said, her voice quiet but firm. I've fought too hard to let you take everything away from me. I'll bring it all to light if I have to. You won't win. Ben stood up, his chair scraping loudly against the floor as he moved around the table toward her. He was closer now, looming over her with an air of menace. You don't understand, Ruby. This isn't just about power. It's about survival. You think you can outsmart me, but I've been playing this game for much longer than you. Ruby stood her ground, refusing to let him intimidate her. Maybe you've been playing longer, but that doesn't mean you're going to win this time. He leaned in, his face inches from hers. You'll regret this, he whispered, his voice a low, venomous hiss. I promise you that. Ruby's pulse quickened, but she didn't flinch. We'll see about that. As she left the building, Ruby felt a strange mixture of anger and fear. Ben's words echoed in her head, gnawing at her thoughts. The situation was more complicated than she had thought. She couldn't trust anyone, and the stakes had never been higher. But there was no turning back now. She couldn't let him win. Back at her office, Ruby sat in her chair, staring out the window, deep in thought. The weight of the decision she had made pressed down on her chest, but she couldn't afford to doubt herself now. She had one shot at this, one chance to expose Ben and protect everything she had worked for. Clara walked in quietly, her eyes searching Ruby's face for any sign of how the meeting had gone. Did he say anything? Clara asked, concern evident in her voice. Ruby didn't answer immediately. She leaned back in her chair, rubbing her temples. He's a monster, Clara, and he's not afraid to burn everything to the ground if it means saving himself. Clara sat down across from her, folding her arms. So, what now? Ruby took a deep breath. Now, we make sure that he can't escape. We find everything we need to take him down, and we do it before he has a chance to strike first. Clara nodded, her expression resolute. We'll get him, Ruby. You don't have to do this alone. Ruby met Clara's eyes, and for the first time in a long while, she felt a glimmer of hope. But it was fleeting. Ben Jacobs wasn't going to go down easily, and the deeper they dug into his dealings, the more dangerous things would get. But Ruby was prepared. She had to be. That night, Ruby didn't sleep. She pored over every document, every file, searching for any weakness in Ben's web. She knew that if she wanted to bring him down, she had to be smarter, faster, and more ruthless than he ever had been. She wasn't going to let him destroy her life or her future. But as the hours ticked by, Ruby couldn't shake the feeling that Ben was only one part of a much larger, much more dangerous game. And as much as she hated to admit it, she knew this wasn't just about her anymore. It was about something far bigger, something that could affect everyone in her life. The phone rang, breaking her thoughts. She glanced at the caller ID. It was Clara. Ruby, you need to see this. Clara's voice was urgent. I found something. Something that changes everything. Ruby's heart skipped a beat. What is it? Clara didn't answer directly. Just meet me at the office. You'll understand when you get here. The pieces were starting to fall into place, but the question was Ruby ready to confront what was lurking in the shadows? What did Clara find, and how would it change everything? Ruby drove through the empty streets, her thoughts swirling as fast as the car's tires spun against the wet pavement. The night felt heavier now, the air thick with tension. Clara's cryptic phone call had set her on edge, and she couldn't shake the feeling that things were about to take a turn she wasn't prepared for. As she entered the office building, the dim lights cast long shadows on the walls, making everything feel eerily silent. She took the elevator up to the top floor, her mind running through every possible scenario. What could Clara have found that was so urgent? Was it evidence that could bring Ben down, or had she uncovered something far worse? The elevator dinged, and Ruby stepped out into the hallway, walking briskly to her office. Clara was already there, sitting at the desk with a stack of papers spread out in front of her. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with disbelief. "Ruby, you need to see this," Clara said, her voice shaky. Ruby walked over to the desk, her stomach tightening. Clara handed her a folder, and as Ruby flipped it open, she felt her pulse quicken. Inside were documents, internal memos, bank transfers, corporate emails that painted a much darker picture than Ruby had ever imagined. This is Ben's network," Ruby whispered, her voice almost faltering. "But there's something else. What is this?" Clara pointed to one of the papers. "Look closely. Those bank transfers, some of them aren't even going to companies. They're going to people we don't know. And there's a name on one of the memos that doesn't belong." Ruby's heart skipped a beat as she scanned the document. The name jumped out at her like a neon sign in the dark. Victor Holden. "Who is Victor Holden?" Ruby asked, feeling a cold shiver run down her spine. Clara swallowed hard. "I've been digging. Victor Holden is a ghost in the system. He's not just some low-level operative. He's a fixer. Someone who takes care of things, very bad things. And I think he's the one Ben's been using to clean up his messes." Ruby's mind raced. A fixer? That meant Ben wasn't just corrupt. He was connected to something far more sinister. "I need to know everything about him," Ruby said, her voice steady, though her pulse hammered in her ears. "We have to find out who he's working for and what his endgame is." Clara nodded. "I'll keep digging. But Ruby, this could be bigger than we thought. We're talking about people with power, people who have no qualms about destroying anyone who gets in their way." Ruby didn't flinch. "We'll find them first." She turned and began pacing the office, her mind spinning. There was no turning back now. The deeper they went, the more dangerous it became. She had always known that Ben was a threat, but this was a whole new level of danger. "We need to go public with this," Ruby said suddenly, stopping in her tracks. "The only way we take them down is by exposing everything. If Ben has connections like this, there's no way we're going to get to him by playing by the rules. We need leverage. We need to force his hand." Clara looked at Ruby, her eyes filled with concern. "Are you sure about this? Once we go public, there's no coming back. He'll come after us with everything he's got." Ruby met Clara's gaze. "I'm not afraid of him anymore. It's time to finish this." The plan was set into motion quickly. Ruby and Clara began gathering everything they had on Ben and his connections, working through the night to prepare a full dossier. It was risky, exposing Ben's ties to Victor Holden, and the shady operations they were uncovering would put them in the crosshairs of people who wouldn't hesitate to destroy them. As dawn broke, Ruby stood in front of her computer screen, staring at the final draft of their exposé. It was everything. The damning evidence, the connections, the names, the people who had been pulling the strings behind the scenes. "We're ready," Clara said, standing behind Ruby and looking over her shoulder. "Do you think we'll be able to get this to the public without them stopping us?" Ruby paused, her fingers hovering over the keyboard. She knew that once they hit send, there was no going back. Ben would have no choice but to retaliate. She could already feel the weight of the decision pressing down on her. "We will," Ruby said with finality. "But we need a plan B, in case they try to silence us." Clara nodded in agreement. "I'll start reaching out to some contacts. We need to make sure this story gets out no matter what." Ruby hit send, and the exposé was out in the world. The truth was finally in the open. But even as the email left her inbox, Ruby felt a strange sense of dread. They had set the wheels in motion, but how far would the fallout reach? And who else would come after them? The response was almost immediate. By the time Ruby arrived home later that evening, her phone was flooded with calls, texts, and notifications. The media had picked up the story. And Ben? He wasn't sitting idle. Ruby's phone rang again, the caller ID displaying an unfamiliar number. Her heart skipped a beat. Ruby. It was Ben's voice on the other end, low and dangerous. You made a big mistake. I gave you a chance to walk away. Now you're going to regret it. Ruby's hand tightened around the phone. You're the one who's going to regret this, Ben. It's over. The line went dead, but the sense of impending danger never left her. As the world turned its attention to the scandal, Ruby knew the game had changed forever. Ben was going to fight back, and he wasn't alone. The players she had just uncovered were ruthless, and now they knew she was coming for them. But Ruby was ready. She had taken the first step in a battle that would test her courage, her resolve, and everything she believed in. The question now was, how far was she willing to go to bring down Ben and everyone connected to him? Ruby sat at her kitchen table, her fingers tracing the rim of her coffee cup, staring out the window at the street below. The weight of the past few days felt like an anchor around her neck, but there was no time to sink. The exposé had gone public. The world knew about Ben's dark dealings, but the fallout was just beginning. Her phone buzzed on the table, snapping her back to the present. She grabbed it quickly, half expecting it to be another anonymous threat or a message from Clara about the next steps. But it was a name she hadn't seen in years. Marcus. She hesitated before picking up the phone, feeling a strange mix of anxiety and curiosity. Marcus Thompson had been her partner once, back when she first entered the investigative world. But their relationship had soured after a failed case and a betrayal that Ruby hadn't fully forgiven. She thought he was gone for good, a ghost from her past. But now, here he was again. Ruby, long time no see. Marcus's voice came through, smooth but laced with something else, a kind of urgency. I saw your story. You're playing with fire, girl. Ruby's stomach churned. She knew that tone. It wasn't the casual tone of someone congratulating her. It was the tone of someone who knew the dangers of what she'd just done. I know what I'm doing, Ruby said, her voice steady despite the unease swirling inside her. What do you want, Marcus? I want to help, he said, his words slow and deliberate. I've been keeping tabs on things since we parted ways. And I've got information. Information that could give you an edge over Ben. If you want to take him down, you'll need all the help you can get. Ruby narrowed her eyes. You've been spying on me? There was a pause on the other end of the line. It's not like that. You're not the only one who's been keeping secrets, Ruby. We've got a common enemy now, and it's Ben. And trust me, you don't want to face him alone. Ruby clenched her jaw. She knew Marcus. He wasn't one to offer help without a price, and whatever he had to offer wouldn't come for free. But as much as she wanted to reject his offer, she couldn't deny that he might hold the key to getting Ben before Ben got to her. What do you want from me? Ruby asked, her voice clipped. Marcus chuckled, but there was no warmth in it. Let's just say, I need to be in the game. And if you want to play this smart, you'll let me in. You can trust me, Ruby. I have access to things you can't even imagine. Ruby hesitated. Trust had always been her currency, but it was in short supply these days. Still, she couldn't afford to dismiss anyone who might be able to give her an upper hand against Ben. She'd learned that lesson the hard way. I'll meet you, Ruby said after a long pause. But no funny business. If I don't like what I hear, this conversation ends right there. You've got it, Marcus said, his tone sharp. I'll be in touch with the details. The following day, Ruby met Marcus at an old diner on the outskirts of the city, a place she hadn't visited in years. She walked in, scanning the room for him. The moment their eyes met, Ruby felt the weight of their past and the lingering distrust between them. Ruby, Marcus greeted her, his smile tight, but his eyes calculating. It's been a while. She didn't smile back. Let's get to it. They sat in a booth at the back of the diner, and Marcus slid a manila folder across the table. Ruby opened it, flipping through the pages quickly. It was all here. Documents, photos, accounts, everything she needed to know about Bin's operations. But there was something else. "You've been digging into Bin for a long time," Ruby said, her voice low. "How long have you been involved in this?" Marcus shrugged, leaning back in his seat. "Longer than you'd think. Bin's network isn't as tight as you think. He's made mistakes. I've been watching those mistakes, waiting for the right moment to cash in. And now's the time." Ruby looked at him, her gaze hardening. "And what do you want in return for this?" "A seat at the table," Marcus said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I get my slice of the pie. You get your revenge." Ruby leaned in closer, studying him. There was no sign of deception on his face, but she knew better than to trust appearances. He had his own agenda, and she'd have to keep him close to ensure that he didn't double-cross her when the time came. "Fine," Ruby said, slamming the folder shut. "But if you try anything funny, I'll make sure you regret it." Marcus smiled again, but this time, there was a glimmer of respect in his eyes. "You've always been tough, Ruby. That's why I'm here. I think you've got what it takes to bring down Ben. But you need to understand something. It's not just about exposing him. He'll do everything in his power to bury you, and everyone who stands with you." Ruby met his gaze steadily. "I know the risks, but I'm not backing down now." Marcus studied her for a long moment before nodding. "All right then, let's make sure you don't go down alone." That night, as Ruby sat at her desk, going over the information Marcus had given her, she realized just how deep the rabbit hole went. Ben's empire wasn't just about money. It was about control, power, and it reached farther than she'd ever imagined. But Ruby wasn't afraid. She had nothing left to lose and everything to gain. If this was going to be a war, she was ready for it, and she wouldn't stop until Ben was brought to his knees. As Ruby prepared for the next phase of the plan, she knew one thing for certain. There was no turning back. The stakes had never been higher. And whatever happened, she wasn't going to let Ben or anyone else win. The clock was ticking, and the storm was on its way. The tension in the air was palpable as Ruby stood at the entrance of the old courthouse, the place where it would all go down. The final showdown. The culmination of months of digging, planning, and waiting. Ben had no idea what was coming for him, but Ruby knew the time had come to strike. The city was buzzing with whispers of the expose. Everyone knew Ben's name, but now they would know the truth. The pieces of the puzzle she had painstakingly put together were finally clicking into place. Ben had been untouchable for so long, but Ruby had found his weak points, the cracks in his armor. The evidence was damning, and now it was time to present it to the world. Ruby wasn't alone in this fight. Marcus had kept his word, providing her with the final pieces of information that would seal Ben's fate. The risky alliance had paid off, but Ruby was still keeping a close eye on him. He had his own reasons for helping her, but at least for now, their goals aligned. The truth about Ben was too big to ignore, and Marcus knew that if Ruby succeeded, there would be no place for Ben to hide. Ruby took a deep breath and pushed open the courthouse doors, her heels clicking sharply on the marble floor. She could feel the eyes of the media on her as she walked past them. This was her moment. As she entered the courtroom, she saw Ben sitting at the defense table, his confident smirk doing little to hide the nervous tension in his eyes. He knew something was wrong. He just didn't know how much trouble he was in. Ruby could see it in his posture. He was waiting for something, anything, to save him. But there was nothing left. Her attorney, Clara, was already seated at the prosecution table, flipping through the thick file of evidence they had compiled. When Ruby reached her side, Clara gave her a nod of reassurance. "We've got this," Clara whispered. Ruby nodded back. She had never been more ready. This wasn't just about justice for herself. It was for every person Ben had crushed on his rise to power. She was going to tear down his empire, piece by piece. The judge entered, and the courtroom fell silent. Ruby's heart pounded in her chest as the proceedings began. Ben's attorney stood first, presenting their defense, trying to deflect attention from the charges, spinning the narrative in Ben's favor. But Ruby wasn't worried. She knew what was coming. When it was her turn, she stood tall and walked to the stand. Her back straight, her voice steady. She could feel the weight of everyone's gaze on her, but she didn't flinch. This was her fight. her battle to win. I have evidence that proves beyond a shadow of a doubt that Benjamin Thomas has been involved in illegal activities for years, Ruby began, her voice cutting through the silence. But it's not just the law that's been broken. It's the trust of every person who ever believed in him. She slid a stack of documents across the table. The room was still for a moment, the tension thick. Then, one by one, the pieces of Ben's empire were laid bare. The documents Marcus had provided, insider information, illegal transactions, blackmail schemes. Each page revealed the true scope of his corruption. Ben's face turned white as he sat there, trying to maintain his composure, but it was too late. The walls were closing in. Ruby had orchestrated every move with precision, and now the truth was out. As the evidence piled up, Ben's defense crumbled. His attorney tried to object, but it was clear that the case was lost. Ruby felt the weight of victory starting to settle on her shoulders, but she couldn't relax. Not yet. When it was time for the final statement, Ruby stood and addressed the court, her voice firm. This man didn't just break the law. He destroyed lives. And for too long, he's been able to hide behind his money, his power, and his influence. But today, we take that away from him. She paused, letting the gravity of her words hang in the air. She could see Ben's jaw clenching, his fists tightening at his sides. He was seething with rage, but there was nothing he could do now. I've spent my career exposing the truth, Ruby continued. But this is more than just about the story. This is about accountability. For too long, people like him have gotten away with their actions, while the rest of us pay the price. Today, we change that. The room was silent for a moment as the judge took everything in. It felt like an eternity before he finally spoke. Mr. Thomas, the judge said, his voice cold. The court finds you guilty on all charges. Ben's face twisted in disbelief. His empire was falling apart, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. Ruby had one. As Ruby walked out of the courthouse, the weight of the world seemed to lift from her shoulders. The media swarmed around her, eager to hear her story, but Ruby didn't care about the spotlight. She had done what she set out to do. She had taken down one of the most powerful men in the city. Behind her, Marcus stood, watching her with a knowing look. Their alliance had been a gamble, but Ruby had come out on top. "We did it," Ruby said to him, her voice quieter now. Marcus nodded, a small smile tugging at the corner of his lips. "You always knew how to play the game. I just helped you finish it." Ruby turned her attention back to the street, where the sun was setting on the horizon. The world was changing, and for once, it felt like justice had won. She didn't know what the future held, but she knew this. She had fought for what was right, and that was worth more than any story she could write. And for the first time in a long while, Ruby allowed herself to believe that everything was going to be okay.